A Cowboy for Hire, Riverdale Ranch Romance Book Number 8, written by Jewel Allen, narrated by Melissa Connell and Scott Rose. Chapter 1. Darla. By all accounts, Darla should have been down in the dumps, depressed, or sad as a soggy sourdough slice. After all, her divorce was finalized. Naturally, she felt a measure of relief. James, her husband of 5 years, sold houses like he ran their marriage to the ground, cutting corners and making promises he had no intention of keeping. To add insult to injury, after she discovered he was having an affair with a younger agent in his brokerage, he had the gall to sue her for spousal support. Darla, who was the sole owner and employee of No BS Bookkeeping, wasn't exactly rolling in the dough, though she had had her share of success. Luckily, the judge saw through her ex's flimsy excuse to make a buck and threw his petition out of the courts. The judge also ruled that Darla could keep the house. It was a lovely house, even though in the last 2 years, they had only been walls instead of a home filled with love. A white 2-story colonial gem in a cul-de-sac. The property could easily fetch, give or take, $350,000. But it was too big for one person. The children she had imagined would fill its 6 bedrooms, 5 baths, and great curb appeal only serious buyers please, never came. Once again, much to Darla's relief. And the yard chores alone took the whole weekend and then some. Despite her fondness for good architecture, she decided she could downsize to one of those cute little apartments atop a business on Sunny Ridge's quaint Main Street. First, she needed to sell the house. One fine Saturday that June, she woke to a long list of to-dos, starting with walking around the property to assess what needed to get done. She started out at the front door, nothing like curb appeal to hook in that potential buyer. She stopped short and blinked. Sure, she'd been busy with her bookkeeping service, not to mention a bit hermit-like, since the shoe dropped on her marriage. She hadn't exactly been paying attention to the world out there. Had she really let it go to pot this much? The plants she'd set out that past spring in tubs on her porch were starting to yellow and wilt. The weeds in her flower beds, rather, what had been her flower beds, on the other hand, were thriving. They had taken over and towered nearly waist-high. The only 2 trees on her property had dwindled to sticks. Worse, there were numerous piles of dirt all over the wilting lawn, if one could call it that. Gopher or vole holes to add insult to injury. Darla looked across the street at her neighbors' properties. Usually, she wasn't one to compare. She had more sense than that. But a potential buyer wouldn't look kindly upon the obvious neglect of her yard. No one would understand that the yard was a reflection of her emotional state the past months. Underfed, underwatered, unriddled with pests. Still, it was time to fold. Darla wasn't such a pansy to quail at this little hiccup in her plans. She would fix what needed to be fixed, and then she could list the house for above market value. Squaring her shoulders, she went on in her tour of her yard, each second challenging her optimism. The downspouts that James had promised he would tackle someday had failed miserably, and the foundation was exposed from the constant washout. Darla gulped back her rising panic and raised her eyes heavenward, hoping for relief. Hornets buzzed around nests attached firmly to the hardy board under the stately gables. The hardy board planks themselves had faded from the west-facing facade. Darla walked around the house, sure that she'd discovered all that needed to be done with it. But no, there were surprises still in store for her. More volehills, if it were possible, an even deader lawn, and a pool of water that seemed to be bubbling up along the foundation of the house. Okay, Darla told herself, don't panic, ignoring the shudder that went through her body. I don't need a man, she muttered, girding herself for the work ahead. I can fix this. It's not like James helped while he lived here. She was about to ask once again for a higher sort of help, though she wasn't consistently the praying kind, and that was when she noticed something else. The prayer died on her lips. Squinting, she tried to make out what she was looking at. There were clumps of mud along the highest gable of the house. Were they hornet nests? They looked gigantic. Darla pictured killer hornets on the loose, buzzing out of the nests if she were to attempt to disturb them. She didn't even have a tall ladder. For some annoying reason, James decided to take the gorilla ladder she'd shelled out a lot of money on. During their marriage, he'd never once used it. Darla suspected he would promptly sell it just to get the cash. No sense hiring someone, though. She could take care of these pests, easy peasy. Taking a broom out of the garage, the one that she used to knock spider cobwebs around the front porch, she marched back out to the heat of the day. Sweat formed along her forehead and in her armpits under her shirt dress. She would take care of these nests and then work her way around the house. But the broom was too short, as she suspected. She could, however, throw it up like a spear to knock down the clay formations. The broom sailed up several feet, but there was a reason she never got recruited in track and field in high school. She was no javelin athlete. She blew out her breath and stared at the formations. Keeping her head cocked so far back made her feel lightheaded. She needed to sit down. Better yet, she might go over to her neighbor's house. Ellen was a sassy older lady in her late 70s who frequently gave unsolicited advice, along with some sweet lemonade. Darla needed her words of wisdom this time. Darla walked to Ellen's house. Talk about curb appeal. A 4-foot-tall white picket fence separated the lush green lawn, studded with shade trees, and an asphalt parking space fronting the wide rural road. Poppies grew cheerily in the sliver of dirt between the asphalt and the lawn. It was amazing what could bloom under the toughest of conditions. Approaching the little man gate, Darla put her hand on the faded wood to pull it open, looking around in the yard. Usually, Ellen had her border collies out, but not today. Good. Those dogs were a handful. Darla let herself into the yard, then looked up, startled at the sight. From the back of the yard, 2 large dogs came running at full speed, slamming right into her.
Chapter 2. Chandler. "Good heavens!" Ellen Raskin said, setting down her pitcher of lemonade as she was in the act of pouring some for Chandler. "Whatever could that ruckus be?" Chandler suspected it was Mrs. Raskin's dogs, come to greet a visitor. He'd been greeted enthusiastically over the past couple of days as she'd hired him to find and fix her water leak. He followed her to the front yard, curious. He rounded the bend to the sight of a woman getting knocked down by the 2 dogs. Mrs. Raskin barked, "Statler! Waldorf! Get off her!" The dogs' tails were wagging furiously, and the visitor was still down on her back. Chandler couldn't see past the beasts' bodies to tell who it was. If Chandler's brother Heath were here, he'd have whistled for those hooligans to get off her. Heath was a dog trainer. Chandler strode up to the commotion and grabbed the 2 dogs by the scruff. They both yelped, then tried to wriggle out of his grasp, but Chandler was having none of it. Mrs. Raskin stalked over to join him and took over disciplining her dogs, pulling them away by their collars and taking their fight out somewhere behind him. He needed to check on the woman. The unfortunate victim had her arms crossed over her face. Had the dogs hurt her? Chandler studied her bare arms and legs as her shirt dress had hiked up above her knees for any signs of injury, but luckily there were none. "Are you all right?" he asked. The arms parted, revealing a shining and smiling face. Her brown hair was chopped stylishly at the jawline, a huge bangle earring on each ear. Her expression was full of spunk and laughter. Those eyes were an interesting golden color, or perhaps it was the reflection from the sun above. She was undoubtedly the most beautiful woman he had ever laid his eyes on. She laughed. "Oof, those beasts!" Even her laugh had a golden quality to it. "They are beasts, all right," Mrs. Raskin said. "Get up on your feet, Darla. I don't think I can hold on to those 2 any longer." "It's okay," Darla said, accepting Chandler's outstretched hand and getting back on her sandaled feet. "I'm a tough cookie." "If you say so," Mrs. Raskin said. The dogs swarmed around Chandler and Darla, almost boxing them in. Chandler was vaguely aware of her hand being soft and smooth. her eyes of that remarkable color raised to his. Her expression faltered, as though his close scrutiny was making her feel self-conscious. "Hi," he said. "I'm Chandler Brown." Her eyes fell to his jaw, then to his eyes. "You're Sheldon's brother." "Right." He gazed at her in confusion. "Have we met before?" She nodded. "You did some work for my husband. Former husband, that is. James Peterson. I've seen your name on checks before." Chandler blinked, broad-sided by this knowledge. James Peterson was a stingy employer, always behind on his payments for renovations to houses he was trying to sell. Eventually, Chandler just told him that he wasn't available. James Peterson's business wasn't worth all the headache. "I'm Darla," she said. A footfall sounded nearby, reminding Chandler of Mrs. Raskin. She was limping over with a hand on her hip. "I think I tore a muscle. These brutes." She looked at Darla. "Are you all right, my dear?" "I'll survive." Darla smiled. She glanced at Chandler. "I'm sorry to intrude on your visit with Ellen. I can come back." "The more the merrier." Mrs. Raskin waved and motioned for the two to follow her. "Come, get a tall drink of lemonade." "Have you had her lemonade?" Darla leaned toward Chandler in a conspiratorial whisper. "Yes." "It's the best, isn't it?" He followed her to the backyard, his mind still dizzy from his meeting her. Chandler wasn't exactly looking for love at age 32, but it seemed it was here, knocking at his door. Once upon a time, he had been in love with 𝗵𝗶𝗿𝗲. She broke his heart, however, choosing the big city over him and moving away. When he discovered recently that she'd come back to help her grandma, Chandler entertained the thought of courting her again. A brief moment of insanity that soon passed as he swore off romance. But this lady was making him forget his vow. "I'll guzzle a quick drink," Chandler said. "Then I'll get to fixing your water leak. It may take me an extra day to finish." "No rush," Mrs. Raskin said. "I've got all the time in the world." Except Chandler had other calls to be to, and already he was running behind. "I wish I could dawdle, ma'am," he said, wincing, "but I've got another appointment after this." He didn't say more, especially in the presence of Darla, who had settled herself comfortably into one of the patio chairs. He didn't want to be one of those people who was always busy, with no time to enjoy life. He downed the sweet ice-cold lemonade and smacked his lips in appreciation, his eyes colliding with Darla's. They held a frank, intrigued expression, which she hid quickly by lowering her gaze. So, this was James Peterson's ex. He wondered about a woman who would fall for a slick guy like him. Had they met before he had turned into the real estate talker that he was, or did they know each other well before, when he was bootstrapping his business? Chandler didn't have a personal policy about dating divorcees, but he knew there would be some baggage. In fairness to Darla, he didn't want to assume anything about her former marriage. "You're a handyman?" she asked over the rim of her drink. "Yes." He set his empty glass down on Mrs. Raskin's glass-top table. "And a great one at that." Mrs. Raskin poured more lemonade in Chandler's glass, and he didn't object. "You know me, Darla. I'm very picky about the people I work with." Darla nodded with a smile, her expression speculative. "I happen to need some help getting my house ready for sale." Chandler wasn't exactly looking for love, but Darla was single, as he was. He wouldn't say no to this message from the universe, but he wasn't in a rush either. He could see how this unfolds, starting with working for her. "I'm happy to give you a bid," he said. "Depending on the size of the job, I could possibly squeeze you in between others." "They aren't huge jobs," she said, looking almost embarrassed. "It almost seems like a bother asking you to look at them. I'm sure I could do them myself." "I've no doubt you could, but we can see what you've got." "When can you come over?" she asked. Her golden eyes with that laser-focused expression snared him. His brain had slowed, almost to the point of incomprehension, then started functioning again. How about tomorrow? He suggested. He glanced at the waterlogged section of dirt near Mrs. Raskin's foundation. I've got this to take care of today. I should be able to come over tomorrow afternoon. That's great. Darla knocked back the dregs of her drink and thanked Mrs. Raskin before making her way to the front and out. Chandler followed her with his eyes. He was looking forward to seeing her the next day, even if it only meant working around her property. She's something else, isn't she? Mrs. Raskin said. He cleared his throat, his cheeks warming at his client reading his thoughts. She seems nice. Mrs. Raskin guffawed. Nice. That's the best compliment you can give the gal. Come on, Chandler, you can get more imaginative than that. Okay, he conceded. She's a very attractive lady. Mrs. Raskin turned thoughtful. I would try to set you up normally with my neighbor, knowing you both are single, but she's been in a bad marriage. I'm sure you know where I'm going with it here. Chandler wondered what a good way was to politely rebuff his client. This discussion was getting a little out of hand. I think so? Mrs. Raskin chuckled. I get it. You don't like getting put on the spot about dating. Well, young man, carry on. You know where to find me. Yes'm, he said, tipping his cowboy hat. He was glad that Mrs. Raskin had stopped her matchmaking for the moment, but just the same, he couldn't help but throw a glance the direction of Darla's house. She had gotten her mail and was making her way down a path to her front door. When he turned back to start his work, Mrs. Raskin was watching him with bright eyes. Ma'am, he said, before moving on to his task.
Chapter 3. Darla. All afternoon, as Darla worked at her desk overlooking her weedy front yard, she thought of Chandler. He wasn't exactly the most fashionable man on the block, with his tan work pants and his faded plaid long sleeve, but he had a comforting presence, someone capable of fixing a problem around the house or yard. And all right, she had to admit, he was handsome, with those eyes that gazed at her warmly and that chiseled jaw with a 5 o'clock shadow. The cowboy hat on his head set him apart from other handymen. No doubt, he was a horse owner like Sheldon. At the city's planning and zoning meetings, where Darla had served now for 4 years, Sheldon usually prefaced his observations with, as a horse owner. Other than that, he was Sheldon's brother, and that James had hired him for previous maintenance jobs. She knew almost next to nothing about Chandler. Did it really matter? She simply wanted to hire him to fix stuff around her house, not that she wanted to date him or anything. She glanced at the clock on her fireplace mantel and blew out a breath. It was time to quit for the day, get a little bit of dinner, and then head to P&Z. It was a thankless job. Her role on the P&Z. She had been approached 4 years ago by the mayor then to serve without pay on the commission. She didn't mind the few hours she gave up to help her newly adopted town. Moving here, unfortunately, became a source of heartache, the reason she'd gotten entangled with James in the first place. As she considered moving to Sunny Ridge, she'd met James at a house showing. He'd pursued her relentlessly, and she was flattered. He was good-looking and full of charm. Unfortunately, he was that way with any other woman. But Darla didn't discover that until they'd been married a year. By then, she was determined to make the best of things. The day James had an affair, however, he had crossed the line. Darla could stand a flirt of a husband, but not an adulterer. She massaged her temples. Thinking of her ex always gave her a migraine. Best to think of other things, like a certain cowboy who was handy around the house. That is, if Darla cared about such things on a superficial level. The fiasco with James had made her more picky about any future partners. She was determined to give herself plenty of time to recover from her divorce before jumping into the next relationship, if ever. Darla shook her head and got on with dinner. Living by herself, it was easy to resort to boxed meals, but tonight, she actually had something festive from scratch. She took out the salmon from the fridge and seasoned it simply with salt and pepper. A few minutes scorching it in the frying pan in some olive oil, and the house had turned fragrant. She paired the fish with some rice and quinoa she had left over from a couple of nights ago and took her food out to the back deck. As she ate her simple meal, she glanced up at the gable in the back of her house. Her eye caught movement, which gave her pause. For a couple of seconds, she watched as she saw a blackbird coming out of a clay nest. A bird? Birds were roosting on her gable. Her eyes traveled down the length of her house's back wall, where she noticed white splotch marks along the foundation. Ugh, bird poop. She'd heard of swallows nesting on houses around Sunny Ridge, but this was the first she'd noticed them here before. Why would they decide to roost on her house after all this time? And how could she possibly shoo them off? Those were questions she would save for Chandler the next day. For now, she needed to go to P&Z. She cleaned up after her meal and changed for the meeting in a yellow silk blouse that mirrored the golden highlights in her eyes and her best pair of jeans. The combination was flattering, but professional enough to be taken seriously. She hadn't been 1 month into the job on the P&Z when she realized that the old-timers in Sunny Ridge not only had this bias against newcomers, but women in government as well. Darla had worked hard to gain her fellow commissioners' respect, as well as to get taken seriously by the public. Satisfied with her appearance, she grabbed her tote full of developer plans she needed for tonight and arrived 5 minutes early to the meeting. With sports starting up again in the spring, she hardly expected an audience. To her surprise, she saw there was a whole line of men in cowboy hats sitting all in a row inside the council chambers. One of them looked up, a glint of recognition sparking in his eyes. Chandler Brown smiled at her from where he sat. Darla smiled back and, as casually as she could, made her way to the front where the P&Z sat. Great, she thought. No pressure.
Chapter 4. Chandler. Chandler wouldn't have been at this meeting were it not for his good friend Royal Sutton. Royal was a car mechanic by day and rodeo clown by night. Though if it were up to Royal, he'd be called a bullfighter. Like one of them matadors, you know? Royal had said early on when he started his career. Just a fancy way of calling it, Chandler sassed him back. They'd known each other for a long time, since they were in junior rodeo. Chandler got out of rodeo and into construction, while Royal went into the entertainment part of things. Royal's repair work had started to keep him busier and was angling to quit the rodeo work altogether. Chandler couldn't picture his friend quitting, though. He loved rodeo too much, but repair work paid the bills. "I'm not there just to make people laugh," Royal once defended his profession. "I'm there to keep the cowboys from becoming mincemeat." "Let me know when they give you one of those Nobel Peace Prizes," was Chandler's comeback. But today wasn't a jokey kind of day. Royal needed testimonials so he could build his dream, his own car repair shop. Chandler could already picture in his head dozens of clowns with their red noses and brightly colored outfits swarming Royal's property at the north side of town next to the sewer. The location alone was enough to inspire a bunch of jokes, but Chandler wasn't going to stoop to this level. Mainly because he knew how much this repair shop meant to Royal. And now he was having second thoughts speaking for his buddy, however worthy his cause was, because there, walking into the chambers and taking her place in front next to Chandler's brother Sheldon, was none other than Darla. She had smiled back at him when she came in, and all sensible thoughts fled his mind. She was wearing a pretty yellow blouse and jeans that hugged her amazing legs just right, and sandal heels with bright red polish on her toes. She looked put together and mighty fine. He soon became aware that he wasn't the only one thinking these thoughts. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Royal asked, elbowing Chandler. "Depends what you're seeing," Chandler whispered back. "Gorgeous lady at 2 o'clock. Royal seemed to liken scoping out ladies to hunting, where he could spot ducks even before they were flushed from the marshes. "Yep, I've seen her. She used to be married to James Peterson," Royal said. "Really?" Chandler feigned ignorance. Maybe he'd get more information out of Royal by doing so. "Really?" Royal said. "She's free as a bird. A little older than me, but I like them mature." The conversation was starting to turn distasteful to Chandler. "She's probably also much smarter than you," he said. "She'd make you read books and listen to National Public Radio." "NPR?" Royal breathed out low. "Golly gee, never mind then." Chandler smirked to himself. Royal had been his best bud, but he needed to protect his own pasture, so to speak. And for Chandler, Darla was in his sights. Seeing her at the meeting was another sign from the universe that maybe Chandler should make a move. The next day, if all went well at her house, he would ask her out. "Good evening, everyone." Darla greeted Royal. Chandler noticed that she was trying hard to not look at him, which was a bit disappointing and hopeful all at the same time. Maybe she was attracted to him too? "Welcome to Sunny Ridge's Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. I'm Darla Gregory, the chair of the P&Z. That answered one of Chandler's burning questions. Was she going by her married name still? She opened up the meeting to a discussion and vote on the minutes from last month's meeting. Sheldon, Chandler's brother, made the motion to approve them. Chandler was glad to see him there. If nothing else, there was one secure vote in Royal's favor. Darla looked back at the audience. "We'd like to invite anyone to give any public comment. Please give your name for the record and keep to about 3 minutes." "That would be you," Royal said, jabbing Chandler at the side. Chandler got up and stood at a lectern that faced the commission. There wasn't a microphone, but this all felt official. He glanced at Darla and felt encouraged when he saw the kind smile that formed on her lips. "Good evening. My name is Chandler Brown. I've come here to speak in support of my friend, Royal Sutton. He wants to build a car repair shop in his neighborhood. He has been into cars all his life, and this would be the fulfillment of his lifelong dream. Even though it's zoned residential, the traffic would be minimal and could be a boost to Sunny Ridge's economy, not to mention one less reason for our residents to go into the big city." After his speech, Chandler paused to see if anyone had questions for him, but they all just stared back, with Sheldon nodding as though to say he did good. Darla's expression had changed. Her stare had hardened, like she was upset about something. Was it something Chandler had said? "Thank you," he said before sitting down, kind of worried now. "Thanks," Royal whispered. "You bet." Chandler was still thinking about Darla's reaction when she called the meeting to order. "The first item on the agenda is Mr. Royal Sutton's petition to build a car repair shop," she said. Again, her expression changed ever so slightly, like she was smelling manure clear from a mile away. Was it just Chandler's imagination, but did her voice seem to drip with irritation? Royal sauntered over and stood, relaxed like a horse whose leg was half-cocked. "Good evening." A series of good evenings followed. Leaning against the podium, Royal said, "As you all know, I own property on Main Street. I'd like to change the zoning of that land to commercial so I can open a car repair shop." "Please state your name," Darla interrupted. There was a surprised silence. Hadn't she already referred to Royal by his name? Chandler sat there confused. The ways of politicians were clear as mud. "Royal Sutton," he said, sounding annoyed. If he ever had a liking for Darla Gregory, it didn't show now. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton," Darla said. "I'm surprised you're here again based on our discussion in a previous P&Z meeting." Sheldon spoke up. "I encouraged him to come back." Darla turned to him. "But we all know he's spinning his wheels." "Maybe here," Sheldon said pleasantly. "But I think City Council might look upon this a bit more favorably than this body. We have to follow zoning regulations. City Council has a bit more leeway than that." Chandler listened to the exchange as best as he could follow. Everyone was speaking formally and bandying around big words. Chandler was a simple man, and he appreciated simple language. Best he could follow, he gathered that Royal's property was zoned residential, and Darla didn't think it was a good idea to build a commercial building among houses, especially horse properties. Debate went on back and forth with Sheldon taking Royal's side. Darla sounded smart, and also seemed to talk down at his friend. Any attraction Chandler had for her evaporated. She sounded like a nightmare of a woman to live with, let alone date. She would poke a hole through every objection in an argument and relish it. Perhaps we could table it and Royal could come back to present a concept for his repair shop, Sheldon suggested, but Darla cut him off. I'm prepared to make a motion right now, she said. The others on the commission looked at her warily. She looked up at Royal. You may be seated, Mr. Sutton. Royal obeyed, exchanging concerned glances with Chandler as he took his seat. Darla cleared her throat. I move that this application be denied. Wait, Royal piped up. What exactly does that mean? It means exactly how it sounds, Darla said matter-of-factly. It's a no. Now if the audience will please remain silent as the commission votes. She darted a warning glance Chandler's way. A super old guy who didn't say a peep throughout the proceedings seconded the motion. Chandler wanted to spring to his feet and boo. It seemed that thanks to Darla, the rest of the P&Z, with the exception of Sheldon, was poisoned against Royal's dream. Royal, glancing back at Chandler, looked crushed, to say the least. All in favor, say aye, Darla said. The grizzled guy who seconded her motion raised his hand, as did one other man. Half-heartedly, uncertain, Sheldon was the only nay vote. Darla looked around, her expression approving. Roll call vote. After the votes, Darla said, The ayes have it. Mr. Sutton's petition is denied. Beside Chandler, Royal looked stunned. Now, wait a minute, the hesitant commissioner said. What just happened? You just voted against the petition for Royal's property to be rezoned to commercial, Sheldon said. Did you mean to do that? I wasn't sure, but I was on the fence. The man waved a hand. I'll let it stand. That little bit of hope that had flared in Chandler's chest on behalf of his friend died a sure death. Royal's head slumped over, his shoulders hunched. His cowboy friends in the audience patted his shoulder in sympathy. There were other items on the agenda, but Chandler couldn't wait to get out of there. He was disappointed in the guy who could have voted to approve this, and he was most certainly disappointed in Darla, who sat there without remorse over crushing Royal's dreams. Chandler stood and glanced over at her as he walked past, not disguising his irritation.
Chapter 5. Darla. Darla was used to people hating her for her work on the P&Z, but Chandler's expression as he left the council chambers miffed her. She reminded herself to not take his scowl personally. After all, he disapproved of a decision she'd made for the betterment of Sunny Ridge. She told herself she wouldn't lose sleep over it, but she did that night, turning over the meeting's events in her mind. First, seeing the attractive cowboy handyman in the audience was a pleasant surprise, until he started talking up his friend's project. It wasn't the first time Royal had stood in front of the P&Z. He had tried it months before, casually throwing out the idea of an auto repair shop right next to the city sewer ponds, which wasn't a deal-breaker except that the land was zoned for 10-acre parcels. Sheldon Brown had championed it then, too, pointing out that as it was, the city only got a pittance in taxes. But Darla stood firm. She was surprised that more of the town's old-timers didn't see it her way. It seemed that Sheldon and his ilk believed it was worth preserving farmland only if it sat next to your ranch. And now, they were able to stop Royal Sutton from creating a business out in the boonies. Darla allowed herself to sleep in a little, but still woke to a headache. She was in the middle of eating breakfast when her phone rang. "Hello," she said into the receiver. "This is Chandler Brown." Darla sat up straighter, her fingers involuntarily moving to her mussed hair. "Hi there," she braced herself for a scolding. Was he calling about Royal's application? "Hi." His voice was curt, and she was sure of what would follow. "I was just calling you to say I can't come over today to look at your bird problem." Oh, right, the birds. She had forgotten about their appointments, so he wasn't calling about Royal. Oddly, she felt lighter, relieved. Maybe he hadn't taken the denial as hard as she thought he had. "Okay, when can you come by?" "I think it's best if you hire someone else." Darla sat stock still, so he did have a beef with her after all. Figured. "Does this have something to do with last night's P&Z?" she asked. "I guess you could say that." "I didn't realize you were so petty," she bit out. His voice was low. "I don't consider my friend's dream to be petty." She didn't know what to say to that. His tribal mentality was disappointing. "Hello?" he said. "I'm here. I was just thinking of a polite way to reply without minimizing your friend's dream." "Oh," he said, "as opposed to the uppity way you talked over Royal yesterday?" "I wasn't condescending," she said, bristling. "Maybe in your mind you weren't," he said, "but it sure came across that way." "Listen," she said, massaging her throbbing temple, "you're not even really supposed to talk to me." "Pardon me? I mean, usually the public can't just talk to the commissioners. It keeps us from being influenced by special interests." "Well then, it's good that you won't be hiring me after all, isn't it?" Just like that, he hung up. Darla stared at the receiver, seething, then replaced it in a huff. It was going to be okay. The last person she'd want to hire was that cowboy anyway. Still, his accusations stung, like she'd intended to be a dream killer. She made calls to handyman services, 3 in a row. To her astonishment, they all said they couldn't help her. When she probed further, she finally ferreted out that their reluctance was all thanks to her ex telling them not to help her out in whatever shape or form. For a moment, Darla was dejected. Even after their marriage, James was still wreaking havoc on her personal life. And then she got mad, steaming mad. So mad that she got up off her kitchen bar stool and went outside to tackle the house projects herself. After taking inventory of all that she needed to do, she knew she needed a taller ladder. It probably wouldn't fit in her little sedan, but she could always open her car hatch. She spotted a familiar-looking truck in the parking lot, a beat-up behemoth of a Ford truck, and then realized where she'd seen it before. It was Chandler Brown's. Great. It was very tempting to just drive away to the next city over, where they had a bigger selection in their hardware store. But she wasn't one to turn tail. She'd just as soon face Chandler than drive an extra 20 minutes out of her way for a ladder. The hardware store was characteristically empty. Darla noticed that right off when she moved into town. Very few people shopped here. She was glad that despite the lack of business, the Allen hardware store managed to stay open. "Can I help you find something?" Zoot, the owner of the store, came out from the back. He had gray hair and sunken cheeks, so skinny he looked like he was going to blow right out the door, but was the hardest worker she knew. "Hey, Zoot," she greeted him. "I need the biggest ladder you got." "What business have you got getting a ladder, lady?" he teased good-naturedly. "You aren't repainting those gables of yours, are you?" Nope, though she made a mental note to repaint them sometime. No small thanks to the handyman who refused to work for her. "I'm getting rid of some bird nests that I have on my stucco." "Bird nests?" Zoot rubbed his graying beard. "What kind are they, you reckon?" "Swallows, I think," Darla guessed. "Do they have babies in them nests yet?" "I haven't seen any. Why?" "That's lucky. If there were any babies, then you're out of luck until the end of the season." She froze and stared at him. "Why is that?" "Well, it's against the law to disturb them nests while they're bringing up their young'uns." "Is that so?" Darla actually wasn't sure if she'd seen any baby birds, but she hoped there weren't any. "Then in that case, I need that ladder right away. The longer I stand here, the more likely for there to be babies." "Got the smarts you do," Zoot said, tapping the side of his head. Just as Chandler Brown rounded the corner with a cartload of supplies. Well, this was awkward. He was dressed similar to the day before, tan pants but with a different plaid shirt. On his head was that cowboy hat that seemed to fit him just right. "Hello?" he said, nodding. "Hello." Darla averted her gaze and pretended to hang on Zoot's every word. "Anyway, that ladder?" Zoot ambled along. "Got one right back here with your name on it." She followed Zoot to the back, where he showed her the only ladder in stock. It was a heavy-duty, commercial one that was probably overkill for what she needed, but at least it would be good for the long haul. When they returned to the cash register, Chandler was still standing close by, browsing through a bin of discounted items. She avoided his eyes. No reason to be all friendly-like, she figured. He was the one that had gotten all personal. Darla paid, and balancing the ladder on her small cart, made her way gingerly through the store's sliding doors and paused as she faced a side door that would have to be held open so she could exit. As she stood there contemplating her options, Chandler came along. "Need a hand?" he said. She shouldn't be so sore about his rejection the day before, but she couldn't help it. The last person she wanted helping her was this cowboy who obviously had a bone to pick with her. "No, thank you," she said, steeling her jaw. "I got it." He gave her a lingering glance, then said, "All righty." As he swung the door open, she kicked her foot out to keep it from shutting completely. It would have been well and good, except now her legs were doing the splits, and there was still the matter of the ladder somehow getting through the doorway. It was like a grown-up version of Twister, except with a real possibility for injuries. She couldn't even try to grab something to hold the door open with, because if she were to let go, the glass door would slam right into the ladder. As she tried to come up with solutions for her dilemma, she glimpsed a sight of Chandler Brown leaning against his truck, watching her, his arms folded across his chest, like he was starved for entertainment, which made Darla even more determined that she was going to get this ladder to her car. Somehow, she managed to get out of the store without impaling herself or the door. She wheeled the ladder across the parking lot to her car that appeared even smaller than when she started. At least Chandler had the decency to climb into his truck, whose bed could probably carry 10 ladders if he had a sincerely helpful bone in his body. She positioned the cart alongside her car and told the ladder to stay before opening the trunk of her hatchback. The ladder hung in balance for a second before wobbling down one end and crashing onto the asphalt. Was Chandler still watching her? She wouldn't put it past him. But right now, she had more pressing matters to think about. Just judging the space visually, the ladder would probably stick out a whole nother car length. However, what other choice did she have? She lifted the ladder, which was heavier than it looked, and slid it onto the open back of her car. So what if it stuck out a good 5 feet? She lived close and would get this thing home in a jiffy. The very least she could do was to tie her hatchback shut. But with what? Woefully unprepared, she had no choice but to go back into the store and get some rope. Well, what do you know? Chandler was still sticking around. She should charge him for the laughs she was sure he was enjoying at the moment. "Stay," she told the ladder before moving away. Of course, right at that moment, Chandler happened to be driving past. He stepped on his truck brakes and killed the engine. Chandler rolled down his window and held up a ball of twine. "Want some?" Darla considered going back to the store to get rope. She certainly didn't want to be beholden to him, but the thought of spending more money on rope that would just gather dust on her garage shelf galled her. "Thanks," she said grudgingly, taking the twine from his outstretched hand. "You ought to let bygones be bygones," he said, smiling. "That's funny," she said, taking a step back. "I was pretty sure you were the one sore about your friend's petition being denied." "I might have taken it too far," he admitted. "Just the same, I should have gone over to give you a bid like I said I would." Darla's pride reared its ugly head. "I've already gone through the trouble of getting a ladder and all. I'll be fine, I'm sure." "You know," he drawled, "I'm trying to apologize here." "I don't hear the word sorry," she retorted. He looked deep into her eyes, ensnaring her attention and making her breath catch. "I'm sorry." Her gaze faltered, and she looked down at the twine in her hand. "Thank you." There was nothing more to say without embarrassing herself, so she walked briskly to her car. The ladder still stuck out, but at least the hatch was closed. By the time she walked back to Chandler's truck to return the twine, she was all sweaty. "Thanks," she said, hoping he wasn't looking at her too closely. His eyes danced. "You bet." With all the dignity she could muster, she returned to her car. She hightailed it out of the parking lot before Chandler could. Her hands started to turn clammy. What was she thinking? Getting a ladder? She was scared of heights. What could she do anyway if she found baby birds in the nests? It wasn't like she could knock them off. Leaning over her faded steering wheel, she drove home with determination. Until she glanced behind. In her rearview mirror, overtaking Chandler's pickup truck, was a cop car. It sped on over, its lights coming on. She pulled over to the shoulder of the road, her heart hammering. Had she been speeding? Today of all days. The cop car parked right behind her, the lights hurting Darla's eyes. Chandler's pickup drove past. Ugh, Darla said, her face burning with humiliation and anger. She shouldn't lay this at the Cowboy for Hire's feet, but if he had only given her a bid like she'd asked. "Hello, miss," the police officer said as he moseyed over to her open window. "Can I please see your license and registration?" She handed him the documents, her spirits plummeting by the minute. What should have been a small errand could turn out to be an expensive one. The cop returned her ID. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked. She fought back a smart aleck answer that sat at the tip of her tongue. "I don't know, officer." "Well, your ladder is sticking out of your vehicle without a cloth marking it. To transport the ladder, you should at least tie something on." She bit her lip. "I don't have a cloth to mark it with, officer." "I'm going to give you a warning for now, but please, next time, plan ahead." Relief coursed through her body. "Thanks so much." "You're welcome. Where are you headed? I'm happy to escort you if you don't have far to go." "Left at the diner. My house is all the way down the street." "After you, miss." Darla led her police convoy down her country lane. Once in her driveway, she waved at him, and off he went. Thank goodness he was a nice cop. She glanced at a familiar truck parked next door at Ellen's. Apparently, Chandler was still working on stuff over there. Not that she cared. She lugged the ladder out back, struggling a little under the weight. Then she lay it on the ground and hefted it, leaning it against the stucco. The gable suddenly looked like it was way up high. Maybe she should just leave the bird nests alone. What harm would they do to her? Would buyers really balk at their presence? As she stood there, she felt something wet on her head. Then, there it was again. Plop. She glanced up, squinting against the sun, and cringed. Bird poop. Not only on her head, but all over the sidewalk next to the house. This won't do. Expelling a frustrated breath, Darla grabbed a broom. She raised her eyes to the prize and began scaling the ladder. At first, her hands shook. About midway through, she wondered if the breeze would ever let up. Toward the top, she was sure there was a hurricane blowing into town. She raised the broom handle to the closest nest and tapped on it. The clay crumbled and fell all the way down to the concrete. She could already picture the headlines the next day. Sunny Ridge resident goes splat like bird poop. Her hands were cold and shaking by the time she reached the ladder's summit. Not to be overly dramatic, but she could now personally attest to that Mount Everest climbers were insane. Her hair swirled around her face and blinded her for one moment. When she opened her eyes, she encountered a pair of beady eyes. Behind the bird were a couple of babies, their mouths open for lunch. "Babies," Darla whispered. Oh no. The mama's beak opened and she started squawking noisily. "Hey, I lived here first," Darla said. Obviously, the bird didn't understand English, but that was the extent of Darla's sass. Mama flapped her wings, all the while giving Darla the death stare. The bird was out to get her, and Darla did the next best thing she could think of. Scream at the top of her lungs.
Chapter 6. Chandler. Chandler's head whipped up. Mrs. Raskin swiveled from where she knelt, weeding in her flower beds. "Heavens!" Mrs. Raskin said. "Did you hear that?" The scream had come from Darla's backyard. Chandler had been neck-deep in a hole he had been digging to trace the leak in Mrs. Raskin's waterline. He nodded and turned fully to the direction of the sound, which was not repeated. "You ought to go check on Darla," Mrs. Raskin said. Chandler was already climbing out of the hole, all covered in mud from head to boots. Dare say I should, but... He looked down at his whole mess. No time to primp, young man, Mrs. Raskin said. You'd better hurry over. Darla's a tough cookie and she wouldn't scream unless she's in deep trouble. With his waterlogged work boots weighing him down, Chandler nonetheless hurried. It was like doing a slow-mo 5K. Come to think of it, that was about his speed when he tried unsuccessfully to make it onto the high school varsity track team. As he rounded the corner to the back of Darla's house, he heard her say, "Get away, evil bird! You're the one trespassing!" Darla was a sight to see. She was waging war with a swallow, swinging her broom in the air. His heart skipped a beat as he took in the tall ladder she was standing on. One wrong move and she could careen down to her doom. "Darla," Chandler said, catching her attention. To tell her what, he wasn't sure. She looked down at him and immediately clutched at the ladder. "Oh dear," she said, hyperventilating. "Oh my, I'm gonna die." The broom escaped from her clutches, barely missing Chandler's head. "Darla, it's gonna be okay," Chandler said. Her eyes still shut, she moaned, "How can you say that? I'm literally on top of this ladder with a bird out to get me and my head is spinning." She opened one eye and snuck a glance at him, then went back to closing them. "Why in heaven's name are you so dirty?" "I was working on Mrs. Raskin's waterline. For a moment there, I thought you'd taken up mud wrestling." "Well, you've taken up bird wrestling," he retorted. "Chandler," her voice was urgent, "this mama has babies, which means that I can't get rid of their nests." "Happy for them." "Of course you would be. You probably love birds as much as you love clowns." Chandler frowned. Darla had such a one-track mind. "Royal's a friend, okay?" Chandler said, trying to keep the exasperation from his voice. "Wouldn't you do the same for a pal?" "They'd have to be a pretty good pal." "Anyway," he sighed, "why don't we get you down?" "I wish I could do that," she said, her voice shaking. "But I can't seem to make my muscles move." "How about you take one rung at a time?" Darla loudly took a deep breath and took one step down. She leaned into the ladder. "I'm good, as long as I don't look down." "Great, you're doing fine." How do firefighters make climbing ladders look effortless? She wondered aloud. They do, huh? It's always that way, in firefighter movies. I don't watch firefighter movies. She paused halfway down the ladder. What do you watch? What was this, the dating game? But he would humor her and play. Home improvement shows? She scoffed. So predictable. At least I'm learning something I can use on the job. Those shows are fakery. She made an impatient sound. No one ever comes under budget or on time with their construction projects. Chandler smiled. Good point. Why'd you come to help me? She asked, about 4 rungs from the bottom. I was over at Mrs. Raskin's and heard you making a ruckus. If you'd been close to death by bird attack like I was, you would too. Come on, just 3 more steps. When her shoes finally landed on the concrete patio, she collapsed against the ladder, hugging it. Made it! She opened her eyes and gazed at his clothes. Goodness, you're even dirtier up close. Chandler rubbed his nape. You're welcome. She rolled her eyes. Thank you. And then her expression softened. Really, I owe you my life. I could have fallen off the ladder. Or worse, I could be stuck up there until kingdom come. Her voice was soft, sultry. Interest flickered in her eyes, sparking his own. He swallowed, then averted his eyes. Just trying to be helpful. Do I need to pay you? She asked. Of course not, he said quickly. Well then, she said, I won't keep you. I'm sure you have better things to do than talk to a mean planning and zoning commissioner like me. Yeah, he did. He had plenty to do. Except at the moment, He couldn't think of a single thing more pressing than standing there, shooting the breeze with Darla. She turned away, breaking the spell. "Have a good day," he said, his voice gruff as he backed up and out of her yard. What exactly happened there between them? Surely he was just imagining things. As he returned to his mud hole, Mrs. Raskin greeted him. Her eyes sized him up. What was the matter with her? She was stuck on a ladder trying to fight off a bird. You know, those swallows roosting by her roofline. Mrs. Raskin chuckled. What a firebrand that one is. Whoever fancies her, best of luck to them. Chandler turned his head, trying to hide his expression. He had a sinking feeling that he was one of those schmucks who would need all the luck in the world.
Chapter 7. Darla. Darla sat in the driver's seat of her car, staring at City Hall, contemplating her next move. This week was the deadline to file for City Council. Having served on planning and zoning for 4 years, she had been toying with the idea of running for elected office. She had the experience. She was an accomplished small business owner. Why was she having second thoughts now? Frankly, it was because of what Chandler Brown had said. By serving the public, was she losing her human touch? Did she look at everything in black and white without a heart? She'd been accused of being hard-nosed before by strangers and acquaintances alike, especially since she was a newcomer and still hadn't figured out how everyone was related in her adopted small town. She wondered if Chandler would vote for her. Not that it should sway her decision to run. Despite their differences, she hoped to win his approval. Maybe, just maybe, he could even advocate for her with his old-timer family. Maybe they could be on speaking terms again. Ugh, she was acting like some teen girl crushing on a cowboy who was mostly annoyed with her. It had been a week since that day when Chandler Brown talked her down that ladder, and she was still reeling from relief. And an emotion she couldn't name. She was still a bit sore about the repair shop debacle, but their last exchange tied her up in knots. She found the cowboy handyman attractive. There, that was it. He wasn't even her type. She'd never dated a cowboy, having grown up in the city. But those eyes, those muscles that couldn't be hidden behind that mud bath, and his confident can-do attitude. They were characteristics that seemed to lure her in like a fish on a line. James had possessed those qualities too, though he was the city slicker version and couldn't be trusted. Still recovering from her divorce, she hadn't felt any interest in another man. Until now. Chandler hadn't exactly been warm or nice to her, except in his eyes, she had seen a flicker of interest, like maybe he found her just a little bit attractive. It also seemed that they were seeing eye to eye for once, into each other's soul. She shook her head to clear it, back to this decision on City Council, enough about Chandler. Before she could lose her nerve, she needed to get out of the car. She swung her feet onto the asphalt parking lot. 1 foot in front of the other was her motto. It served her well. Growing up, despite challenges in her family, while her marriage was on the rocks, and now navigating life as a divorced woman. Would voters even elect someone like her? One without local family ties or tight friendships? A divorced woman whom others of her gender might even consider a threat, or considered a failure by the general public? Her grandpa's words came to her from when he was sick and dying. Don't let them fellers get the best of you. You got as much brains as the next guy, probably even more. You actually use your coconut. This one's for you, Grandpa, she murmured under her breath. Besides, these were the 80s, modern times. Surely voters were more open to women serving in elected positions. Darla opened the double glass doors that led to another pair of glass doors into a lobby with a couch. To the right, the sign pointed to the city recorder's office, which was her destination. A woman with a short bob looked up from behind the counter. Darla knew the receptionist from when she picked up the P&Z packets every other week. Hi, Darla, Jenny said. How are you doing? Good. Here goes. I'm here to file an application for city council. Really? Jenny seemed genuinely pleased. I'm so glad. You'd be fantastic. She looked to her left into an office where a dark-haired woman sat. You can go talk to Shannon. Hi, Shannon greeted her as Darla approached the open door. What's this I hear? Yep, Darla confirmed with a weak smile. I'm certifiable. I have been hoping to see more women applicants, Shannon said, smiling. That's great. Who else is running? Shannon mentioned a couple of names she didn't recognize. How does it work again? Darla clarified. How many open positions are there? There's one open seat, Shannon said. So if there are more than 4 candidates, there will be a primary. She leaned forward, her eyes filled with curiosity. You eventually gonna run for mayor? Darla had briefly toyed with the possibility of running for mayor the next election cycle, but she wanted to start with council to get her feet wet, so to speak. Nah, I'm not that crazy. Sure you are. P&Z is the craziest gig in my opinion. Here you go. She handed Darla a set of forms. You're welcome to take that into the lobby and fill it out. Do you need a pen? She motioned to a container on her desk. Sure. Darla accepted the pen and took the forms to the couch. Once in a while, she looked up to see if someone was coming into the building, and then she'd be busted. Maybe she'd have to tell people that she was actually running for office. But no one else came. She filled out the blank spaces, signed an agreement to make financial disclosures when she needed to, and took the papers back to Shannon. Fantastic, Shannon said. Best of luck. Darla thanked her and exited City Hall. As she came through the outer double-glass doors, she inhaled a deep breath of the fresh June air. She'd never felt more in her element than in the moment, like she could do this, and anything. Now, if only a certain cowboy for hire could take her as seriously.
Chapter 8. Chandler. So, what do you think? Royal raised his blue eyes to Chandler and waited, seated at Chandler's kitchen table, his cup of coffee untouched. A cowboy hat covered his short blonde hair that liked to fly in all sorts of directions. Chandler blinked. You're thinking of running for city council? Well, yeah, Royal jutted his chin out. What, you think it's a bad idea? No, not really. I mean, I think it's great that you want to do something like that. But, Royal prompted, I think voting for a clown could be a hard sell. There, I'll just be up and up about it. Bullfighter. Whatever. Chandler gave him a thoughtful glance. How'd you come up with this? You want the truth? When Chandler nodded, Royal said, It was after that lady thumbed down my repair shop dream. I figured if I ran for city council, I could pass things like that. You wouldn't be able to vote your own businesses in, I don't think, Chandler frowned. You don't say. Royal's shoulders sagged. Still. He narrowed his eyes and sat up straighter. I'm just fed up with folks calling the shots like that lady in that commission. I want to call the shots. That lady, being Darla Gregory, made Chandler uneasy. Royal needed to let go of his grudge, especially if Chandler held any hope of befriending the lady. Not that he had any concrete plans anytime soon to ask her out or anything. Frankly, he didn't dare. Chandler studied his friend. We've known each other all our lives, Royal, and you can count on me to tell you the bald truth, no sugarcoating. But are you sure you're doing this for the right reasons? Shucks, Chandler. Royal scratched his nape. You're making me second-guess myself. Sorry, I don't know anything about running for office, but it strikes me as a lot of work. Royal frowned. I reckon I'm related to half the town, so I should get at least that many votes. What about the newcomers? Shrugging, Royal said, What about them? They can vote for me or not, no skin off my back. Right, Chandler nodded. I'm not one to squelch your dream, bud. If you want to do this, then I say go for it. Royal's eyes lit up. You going to be my campaign manager? Doing what? I don't know, Royal said, looking stumped. But it sounds impressive, doesn't it? I'll put up signs or something, but you know I don't like selling things. Royal stood. That's good enough. Thanks. I knew I could count on you. You bet. Chandler stood too. I gotta go to City Hall and file for a permit. I was headed there, actually, to fill out the city council paperwork. They convoyed down Main Street, each in his own truck. Chandler still couldn't believe that Royal, who was the very opposite of law-abiding when they were in high school, now wanted to join the respectable ranks of politicians. Actually, on second thought. Kidding aside, Chandler had to hand it to his friend. He was acting like a responsible citizen. Chandler followed Royal into City Hall and waited in the lobby while his friend grabbed the forms. Royal came back out to join Chandler with the papers all rolled up. I have to fill this out, I guess. He looked about as excited like whenever they took a test in high school. Royal was never one who liked writing things out. I'm going to the building department, Chandler said, moseying on over to the other side of City Hall. I might catch you later. Chandler found the building official who gave him the lowdown on a deck building permit, got the information, and rejoined Royal. Royal raised his head at Chandler's approach. All done. Jiminy cricket, they make these things so complicated. He motioned for Chandler to follow him into a hallway where he submitted the papers to a woman Chandler recognized. Shannon was the city recorder, but to him, she was the cousin of a friend from high school. Do you know who else is running? Royal asked Shannon. Chandler perked up. It would be interesting to know who the other candidates would be. George Wendell is, Shannon said. Chandler was not surprised. George was always spouting off on some political issue or another at the local cafe. Quentin Osmond, too. Quentin. Royal tapped the desk. Anyone else? Yep, it's a woman. She sits on planning and zoning. At that description, Chandler lifted his head and held his breath. Royal's expression turned icy. There was only one woman on P&Z. Darla Gregory, Shannon replied helpfully. Royal staggered out of Shannon's office in City Hall, his face pinched. I swear that woman is out to get me. She signed up before you did, Chandler pointed out. Chandler recalled Darla's feisty attitude at P&Z. The woman had guts, and now she was going to go head-to-head with his best friend from high school. Royal sputtered. Well, yes, but why did she have to stick her nose in this race? Maybe because she's a competent, qualified woman, Chandler said. What? Royal glared at him. Are you getting sweet on her? Chandler frowned. How'd you jump to that conclusion? I mean, I know she's a looker, but... Royal, would you listen to yourself? Chandler's annoyance rose. You think the only way she's going to win is by flashing that gorgeous smile or waving like a beauty queen at the 4th of July parade? I knew it! I knew it! That woman's cast her spell on you! Chandler was too tired to argue. Think what you want. I said I'd help you, so if you still want me to, you know where to find me. He left Royal, still brooding at his truck. It was only June, and the elections were in November. Chandler sighed. It was going to be a long 5 months.
Chapter 9. Darla. With a plate of cookies in hand, Darla went over to see Ellen. I hope I'm not disturbing you. She looked around, expecting the dogs. Don't worry, my dogs are inside sleeping, Ellen nodded. You better believe you're disturbing me. Earl was telling me about his latest fishing story, so thank you. I heard that. Her husband's voice boomed from inside the house. Let's sit out in the shade, Ellen said, motioning for Darla to follow her to a lean-to that made Darla think of an outdoor cantina. When Earl had first put it up, Ellen invited Darla to come over and admire it. It was the perfect setting for a cold glass of lemonade. Ellen often complained that she was having to put up with her husband, but they were really the sweetest couple. There was no lemonade right at the moment, but already, Darla's body relaxed as she took up Ellen's invitation. A visit with Ellen meant sitting for a good hour, and Darla had prepared for that by picking a slow afternoon. What mischief are you up to? Ellen asked Darla. Mischief? Darla kept a straight face. Ellen raised an eyebrow. You have that unmistakable look of someone who is up to no good. Well, Darla said with a grin, I've gone and done it, Ellen. You've eloped with my handyman? Darla rolled her eyes. Very funny, but no. Oh, dear. Ellen put a hand to her throat. Out with it. I can't stand all this suspense. Darla took a deep breath and blew it out. I filed for city council. Holy smokes, it's worse than anything I imagined. Ellen slapped her forehead. Darla wasn't sure what to say, but then Ellen gave her an impish smile. Way to go, Darla. I'm proud of you. I thought you were upset, Darla said with a relieved chuckle. Now, what would I scold you? I did the same thing a couple decades ago. Darla's mouth fell open. Seriously? Ellen leaned close and whispered, I knew there was a reason why I liked you. Do you have any advice? Darla asked. For my campaign. Ellen looked off into the distance. Boy, it's been so long. I'm sure I'm remembering only the rosy parts and blocking out all the bad. It sure was a lot of work, especially for a woman. I can imagine. Can you? Imagine it and then multiply all that by 2. That's what campaigning was like back then. What did you do? Ellen chuckled. You mean, what didn't I do? I went to bingo night, PTA meetings, fairs, parades, Tupperware parties, you name it, I did it. It probably helped that you've lived here a long time, Darla said. Still not long enough for some people. Being married to Earl only went so far. I admire your gumption, girl. You mean because I'm newly single? Well, that too, but just running. Do you know who else are? I didn't recognize the first 2 names and frankly can't remember them. I signed up close to the deadline, but maybe someone had come in after me. It doesn't matter. Ellen waved her hand. You'll hold your own. Have you talked to any of them older families yet? No, you'll have to start there, Ellen said. You need to win their support. Hopefully, they'll talk you up among their families, and then you can get their voting block. Sounds good. Of course, there's buttons and signs. You're going to need all that. Darla nodded. I've already checked into getting them printed. Good girl. You'll want to be in every parade in Sunny Ridge, starting with the 4th of July. Darla nodded, trying to not let on that her anxiety was spiking at the thought of all the different things she had to do. Are you having second thoughts? Ellen probed. Me? Darla raised her eyes to her friends. No, not really. Atta girl. Fortunately, this town is kind of funny about campaigning. Voters want to know you're serious and want the job, but they don't like you trying too hard. It's really a pickle. They ought to make up their minds, especially since it allows some people to coast to a win without having to work for it. What do you mean? Oh, you'll have some folks bank on their family name. Not that they haven't done squat for this town. That'll carry them far, too. But then they don't campaign, not hardly. They put their name down and wait for the numbers to come in. Ellen's eyes glimmered. Depending on who the other candidates are, you might have an uphill battle ahead of you. Darla's stomach roiled. Ellen patted her hand. Not trying to discourage you, my friend. You know that, right? Darla nodded. She glanced at her friend curiously. Was it worth it? Was what worth it? Running for office, serving on city council. Ellen's eyes got this faraway look. Like I said, it's been a while, but I'll never regret running. Never. Regardless of how many yokels like to Monday quarterback me or dismiss me over my gender or the countless other cuts that people like to inflict on politicians because they haven't the guts to fix problems themselves. Ellen's words made Darla smile. What made all that worth it? A long time ago, Ellen said, her voice sounding wistful, this town was one of the places the state wanted to put a state prison on. Can you imagine all those lights and barbed wire fences marring the overlook? I fought tooth and nail against it. I was sitting on the council, and for the first little while, was the only one who spoke out. Eventually, I got everyone on board, the mayor, the county, even the governor. The outcome wasn't guaranteed. The state had powerful public relations machinery behind them. But we the people prevailed. Little Sunny Ridge versus the giant. That's awesome. Ellen's face glowed. I had my share of victories and defeats. You win some, you lose some. It wasn't always easy going. But I was so glad to do something about problems instead of just lying on my back like a helpless bug. The imagery made Darla laugh. You know what I mean, Ellen joined in the laughter. Some people like to complain, but they never do anything about it. Like one time, Earl didn't like me cooking the same thing over and over, but didn't want to cook himself. I heard that, Earl bellowed. Good! Ellen smiled and leaned forward, pinning Darla with her gaze. Now, if only you could campaign to win that cowboy's heart as well. Darla's cheeks warmed. I'll be too busy campaigning. What would it hurt if you asked him to make your steaks for your signs? Ellen winked. Ellen! Earl called out. Time to get ready for your doctor's appointment. Oh, that's right. Ellen patted Darla's hand. Best of luck to you, my friend. Thank you so much. Ellen opened her arms wide and drew Darla into a hug.
Chapter 10. Chandler. Chandler studied the two men seated in front of him on his front porch. His home was his office, and he hadn't made the switch yet to a brick-and-mortar location. He'd just been plumb too busy. The men couldn't be more different physically from each other. Jim Rogers was tall and lean, looked to be in his late 20s, with tattoos along both arms and stringy blonde hair drawn back in a ponytail. Chandler wasn't an expert on tattoos, but in his opinion, these were some of the best he'd seen, almost like art, with the ink not blurry or smudged. Paul Nebeker was dark-haired and short, with a nervous tic of pushing up his thick glass frames. Chandler's guess was that Paul had 4 children at home and a wife who packed his lunches. He looked like he would turn in his neighbor for breaking HOA rules and then claim he hadn't done it. Now, you know that I was advertising for only one position, right? Chandler confirmed. Right, Paul said, pushing up his glasses. But I figured it wouldn't hurt to give you the option to hire 2 for almost the price of 1. Paul got his attention all right. Care to explain? Chandler said. Jim here's my cousin, and he's had brushes with the law, he added hastily. Nothing real bad. Chandler turned his gaze onto Jim. What kind of brushes with the law? Paul was about to answer, but Chandler held up a hand. Why don't you let your cousin speak? Paul nodded and turned to Jim. Well, I stole some equipment from my former employer, Jim said. Chandler blinked. What kind of equipment? A tractor. A tractor? Chandler echoed. Isn't that pretty big to sneak out? Jim rubbed his nape. It was in a gated yard, and I had keys, so one night me and my girlfriend took it. Tried to sell it, but got caught. Why'd you need the money? Chandler asked. Jim covered his mouth for a second and mumbled, to buy drugs. Chandler leaned back into his chair. Was he so desperate to hire someone he was even considering Jim? I know what you're thinking, Paul said, but he's a real hard worker. Are you? Chandler asked Jim. Yes, sir. What about your addiction? Are you still using? Sworn it off for good after I got out of jail, sir. Jim was quick to answer. I can vouch for that, Paul said. Chandler turned his attention to Paul. Why do you care so much about getting Jim a job? Paul's mouth gaped open in surprise. Wouldn't you? For a family member? Chandler thought of his brothers. If one of them ran afoul of the law, would he try to help them reform? Not necessarily. I mean, especially if they're adults. Well, Paul said, looking away then back. I'm all Jim's got. Both my parents have passed, Jim confirmed. Are you married? Chandler asked. Got a family, kids? No, sir. How old are you anyhow? Old enough to know better, Paul joked. 25, Jim said. His answer surprised Chandler. I don't get these kinds of job candidates every day. Actually, this was the first job opening Chandler had done. He was getting too busy and too big to do everything, like the job at Mrs. Raskin's, when he had bigger projects he was having to turn down. Fair enough, Jim said. He swallowed visibly. I don't have a very good track record, I know, sir. Chandler. Jim nodded. Chandler. But I promise you I will work hard if you can give me a chance. Chandler scrutinized Jim's body language to see if he was talking hogwash. What it must take for someone with Jim's criminal record to come out looking for a job. If I hire you, he said firmly, there will be no shenanigans. One strike and you're out. Also, you won't be handling money. Hope glowed in Jim's eyes as he nodded. Of course, I understand. Chandler turned to Paul. I will count on you to keep Jim honest. I want my clients to have the best, most dependable service possible. If anything happens under your watch, you'll be terminated too. Paul darted a glance at his cousin. Understood. Very well then. Chandler stood and offered a handshake. Congratulations, you're hired. Jim's eyes welled with tears. Thank you. He gripped Chandler's hand tightly. You won't regret it. I better not, Chandler said, his voice gruff. See you both tomorrow. After the men left, Chandler massaged his neck. Perhaps he could have hired Paul only, without the complication of Jim. On the flip side, he hoped for loyalty from Jim, that he'd be grateful for the second chance. And didn't we all deserve a second chance? For a moment he thought of Darla. Had he blown it with her forever? Or could Chandler lobby for a second chance after such a bad start? He thought of his own friends like Royal. Over the years he and Royal had some differences, but overall they'd stayed close. Chandler would stay loyal to his high school buddy. That meant steering clear of a certain female city council candidate. The phone rang, shaking him out of his thoughts. He picked up the receiver and grabbed a notepad and pencil out of habit. Hello. Is this Chandler? He knew that voice, that soft, alluring lilt. Yes, he answered. This is Darla. Chandler gripped the phone handle tightly. He felt almost guilty for talking to Royal's sworn enemy, or rather, his rival for the city council position. Suspecting Royal's decision was nothing more than revenge, Chandler wished he hadn't been put in this awkward position between the two. Still, he pressed the phone closer to his ear, shamelessly eager to hear what she had to say. Glad I caught you, she said. I was wondering if I could hire you to make some steaks for me. Chandler knew exactly what the steaks were for, but he chose to plead ignorance. Steaks to eat, or steaks to pound into vampires' hearts? Yes, that's it, she said, laughing. I discovered some coffins in my backyard. He wondered if she'd still be friendly with him were she to know what Royal was up to. I like the other kind better, he said, but I'm game to ridding this town of vampires. Good. I'm going to need a lot of steaks, at least 24. It wouldn't take Chandler long to make the steaks, but that wasn't the issue. You could probably buy those at the hardware store, already pre-made. I checked, she said. They have wood that can be cut into the shape I need, but I don't have any power tools. What's this for exactly? He asked. Her voice was cheery, optimistic. I'm running for city council. You don't say. Her girlish laughter made his insides melt. I know. Crazy, huh? Not surprised, actually, he said in truth. I'll take that as a compliment, I think. It was, Chandler blurted out before remembering to keep his distance. Which is why I recommend that you buy some wood, cut them, and whittle them to what you need. It's easy enough. She was quiet for a long moment. Listen, she said, I think I'm catching on here. If you're too busy, I can ask someone else. He blew out a breath. Should he tell her about Royal's candidacy? She would find out soon enough. I am, actually, pretty busy. There was another pause. Sorry to bother you. Her tone was cool. Thanks for your time. and then just like that, she hung up. He stared at his phone before putting the receiver back in its cradle. Under normal circumstances, he would have loved the excuse to see her again. But if Royal were to catch wind... Or maybe he could have handed off the job for Jim and Paul to do. That would have been a good way to get their feet wet and test their competence. Something small and nothing too complicated. He started to reach for the phone, but pulled back his hand at the last minute. What good would it do them anyway if he were to stay in touch with her? It would be a lot of trouble, in more ways than one. He took off his cowboy hat and ran his fingers through his hair. It would work out for the best. This way she couldn't accuse him of sweetening her up so that she'd go easy on Royal, or some such nonsense, and he knew it. Either way, he was sunk.
Chapter 11. Darla. Chandler's rejection stung, but Darla tried to not dwell on it too much. The man was busy, he admitted himself, and it wouldn't be fair if she held that against him, would it? After she hung up and thought about it some more, Darla decided that she could manage to do this. What did it take anyhow to make campaign signs? Some wood, a saw, and staples for the laminated signs, right? So there she was, making another trip to the hardware store. The parking lot was empty, so she was sure not to run into Chandler. Not that she was scouring parking lots for his truck. She got out of her car and made her way into the store. Funny, she hadn't been to a hardware store in a long time. And then she was almost making this a daily trip. Zoot came out from the back. "Good morning," he said. "And what sort of trouble are we up to today?" "Trouble, pshaw," Darla sassed him back. "I'm always in trouble, and you know it." "I do," Zoot nodded gravely. "I've got long-time Sunny Ridgers coming in here complaining that you sure lay down the law down at City Hall." "Do they really?" "No, just fooling you," Zoot smiled. "No one would dare say anything bad to my face about you, or I'm going to chase them out of the store." "Oh, shucks." Her eyes watered. "Thanks, Zoot. It's nice to have a friend like you." Her voice lowered to a whisper. "I don't make a lot of friends on that commission." "As you shouldn't. If you're playing footsies with one developer, why, it won't be seemly." "You got that right." Zoot put his hands on his hips and looked her up and down. "What are we looking for today? Probably not gossip on politics and such." "Not really," she smiled. "I want to make stakes for campaign signs." "Campaign signs." Zoot's normally sleepy-looking eyes widened. "You running for mayor?" She shook her head. "City council." "Why ever not? You'd make a great mayor." "The mayor position doesn't open up again for 2 years. I thought I'd get my feet wet by starting with council." "You got a good head on your shoulders." Zoot gave her a thumbs up. "When you get your signs, give me one, and I'll gladly put it in the front window." "Thank you." Darla wandered the general direction of the lumber yard. As she came out into the sunshine, she stopped at the threshold. There, pulling into the fenced yard, was Chandler's lumbering old Ford. Glancing around quickly, she glimpsed a pile of wheelbarrows and snuck behind them. She had to crouch, as the pile wasn't high enough to keep her out of sight. This was insane. She didn't know what had possessed her to hide from Chandler. Other than that, she wasn't prepared to encounter him so soon, not after their embarrassing encounter. He might even think she was stalking him. Truck brakes squealed, and then the engine was killed. Doors opened and shut, and footsteps seemed to make their way the direction Darla hid. She lowered her head to keep her face covered. Not that it would have helped if Chandler were to come upon her. Her heart thudded, and she felt faint. On the ground by her foot was a spider web so thick she could have sworn it was made of actual string. She couldn't see a spider. Maybe it wasn't actually inhabited. Did spiders abandon webs? Just like snails grow out of their shells? Something moved, something black and spidery. Chandler or no Chandler, she wasn't going to sit here and be a spider target. She screamed and ran out from behind the wheelbarrows before running smack into Chandler Brown. After a startled second, he opened his arms, and she jumped into them, clinging to his neck. "Spider!" she stammered. If she thought Chandler was going to ridicule a grown woman like her for being scared of a tiny spider and jumping in his arms, she was wrong. He simply continued to hold her with a sympathetic expression. And something else. That intense focus she's seen in his eyes before trained on her and her face, her cheek, her mouth. She swallowed as an invisible web seemed to draw her closer to him, too. His jaw already sported a 5 o'clock shadow. It shouldn't be legal for a cowboy to have that this early in the day. He smelled of hay and summer. She wanted to stick her nose into the crook of his neck and breathe deeply. Someone cleared his throat nearby, and they both turned. Royal was looking at them, as though he had indigestion. "Sorry," she whispered to Chandler. "You can put me down now." Chandler hesitated for a fraction of a second before doing so. After being held in his arms, she felt unsteady, like she had been running laps around the lumberyard. Royal stalked off and went a different direction. Darla stared after him, annoyed that after all this time, he was still miffed at her. "He still has his nose out of joint about P&Z, she asked Chandler. Chandler rubbed his nape. "I guess so." He glanced at the wheelbarrows. "Were you needing a new one?" "A new wheelbarrow?" she said brightly. "Nah, I was just admiring them." "And the spiders?" His eyes twinkled. She shuddered and folded her arms across her chest. "It was a big one." "Uh-huh." He tipped his hat at her. "Good seeing you." And then off he went, following after his grumpy friend. Darla sighed to herself. She dissolved into a silly, helpless female thanks to the spider. But then her traitorous imagination played back his capable arms tightening around her, and how close their faces had been, how strong he was. "Stop it, Darla." She looked around for the wood she needed and made a beeline for it. Hearing voices nearby, she craned her neck and looked around the pile. Royal and Chandler were talking. Royal's face held a stubborn expression, while Chandler didn't exactly look happy. Pulling back, she was just about to mind her own business, but she heard the two cowboys' whispers. "Are you going to keep acting sore around Darla?" Chandler was asking. "I know, it's not the Christian thing to do," Royal replied, "but whenever I see that woman, she riles me." "Is this still over the repair shop permit?" "Partially," Royal acknowledged. "Like I said, I can't stand the thought she's running against me for city council." "You gotta let it go, Royal," Chandler said. "She signed up first, remember?" Their words rattled in Darla's head. What was this about Royal running for city council? She barely realized she was gripping a piece of wood, not until she felt a splinter pierce her skin. Suppressing a yelp, she pulled back and cleaned off her finger. Her hands were shaking. Worse, Chandler had known about Royal's candidacy when she'd asked him to help her with her signs. No wonder he hadn't wanted to lift a finger. Royal was his friend, and she was now the enemy. She walked back into the main section of the store and grabbed a large cart for her wood. Returning to the pile of wood, she loaded up her cart noisily. She wanted to drown out Royal and Chandler's voices. Chandler appeared around the corner, his eyes flitting to the woodpile. "Need a hand?" he asked. What a hypocrite he was. Darla knew better than to trust the cowboy. A flash of understanding blinded her, making her reel momentarily. Was Chandler being nice to her so that he could spy on Royal's rival? She wasn't that naive, thank you. "Sure," she said, flashing him a sweet smile. "That's nice of you to ask." Chandler Brown blinked at her. Inwardly, Darla smiled. Two could play at the game. Chandler hadn't had the decency to let her know Royal was running, too. Someone would be getting campaign secrets, all right, and it wouldn't be Chandler Brown. This was going to be entertaining, toying with the cowboy.
Chapter 12. Chandler. Chandler stared at Darla's dazzling smile, his heart racing. Her friendliness was way different than her coolness on the phone, and now he was having second thoughts not helping her with her campaign. Wait, what was he even thinking? He was supposed to help Royal. Helping her load up the wood wasn't exactly helping her campaign, though, was it? And he was still going to help his friend. Chandler heard steps behind him and turned. Royal was giving him the stink eye, as though to say, why was he even talking to the competition? "I'm just going to help her load her wood in her car," Chandler said, and boy, did it sound lame. Chandler followed Darla to her car with an armload. He stacked the wood so it rested on the front passenger seat and across the back, laid down to make room. It didn't take too long. After a couple of loads, he was done. "You got any rope?" he asked. She looked the direction of the store. "I need to grab some." "No worries, I've got some in my truck." Chandler re-entered the lumber yard. Royal was busy loading wood for his stakes into Chandler's truck. Chandler ignored his glare and grabbed a piece of rope as well as a scrap of red cloth he kept handy for transporting long things on the bed of his truck. Darla was waiting by her car, a hesitant smile flitting across her face. "Thank you so much," she said. "We don't want you to get pulled over again," he reminded her. "Right." Chandler stepped back. "Drive safe." "I will." Darla smiled and gave him a little wave. "Thanks again." Chandler watched her drive off until he heard footsteps behind him. "We don't want you to get pulled over again," mimicked Royal before rolling his eyes. "You know, in the time you helped her, we could have made my signs." "Yeah, we could have," Chandler shrugged. "Do you want to help her instead of me?" Royal blustered. "Because if you do, you might as well tell me right now." "No," came Chandler's curt response. "I told you I'd help." Royal gave him a wary glance. "Help me get the stuff." Chandler resisted the urge to look back at the road and followed his friend into the store.
Chapter 13. Darla. Men were fools, Darla thought to herself snidely, and more so that fool of a cowboy. She would have fun at his expense. Darla dialed Chandler's number. He answered at the first ring, breathing hard, like he had been running. "Hello? Is this Chandler?" "This is. It's Darla. You're not in the middle of something, are you?" "I always am, but I've got a minute. What's up?" She smiled. This was going well. He wasn't about to shut her down like he had. "I was trying to figure out how to best cut the wood for my stakes, but I can't seem to figure out how to get the right angle on my saw. Now, I know you're busy, so I don't expect you to stay long at all. Just enough to show me how?" He didn't answer for one long minute, probably trying to figure his way out of this mess. Served him right. "Well, I wish I could come over right now," he said, "but I'm supervising a concrete pour. I can send my new employees, though." Darla's stomach plummeted with disappointment. She was sure he would hightail it over to her house, judging from his loopy expression at the hardware store. Maybe he wasn't into her as much as she flattered herself into thinking. "Of course, that'll be fine." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Actually, I got a minute. I can swing by real quick. Won't hurt nothing." "You can?" Genuine pleasure surged through Darla. "I would appreciate that. Be there in a jiffy." Darla hung up, a victorious smile on her face. She wasn't sure what the end goal would be with Chandler. Maybe she was hoping to lure him to her campaign. Having a contractor on her side would be mighty useful. Or maybe she just wanted to exact revenge, and that would be enough. Within minutes, his truck lumbered and came to a stop in front of her house. She waited for him at her front stoop. He got out, his expression bone-weary, and she felt a little guilty for a moment. He probably didn't have time for her games. She shoved her misgivings to the back of her mind and flashed him a bright smile. He glanced up at her, his eyes widening, his expression softening. Her heartbeat sped up, and a blip of pleasure coursed through her veins. "Hi," he greeted her. He was covered with splotches of gray cement all over his shirt and pants, and even his stubble on that chiseled jaw. His damp clothing clung to his muscled torso. Darla averted her eyes. "Sorry," he said, glancing down. "I'm a mess." "No worries. Come on back." When they got to the sawhorses, his eyes flicked from the circular saw to the wood she planned to cut. "That saw's a little too much," he said. "You need something small to cut the angles with. A miter should do the trick." She considered his suggestion. "I guess I'll have to get one." "I have one," he said. "I think it's in my truck. Would you like to borrow it?" "Sure." "Be right back." Darla waited, her mind racing. Her feeling of triumph was fading fast. She was a grown woman, capable of doing things for herself. And yet here she was, play-acting at being a woman who needed help. She could kick herself. When he returned, she wiped her thoughtful expression from her face and smiled. He handed her a small tool that had a button and an attachment at the end. "Here you go. Do you know how to use it?" "I think so." Glancing down at the power tool, she tried to make heads or tails of it, but had to admit ignorance. "Actually," she said, wincing, "I don't. Just show me how to work it, and I'll get out of your hair." He came closer. So close, she was afraid to look up. He grabbed the tool, their fingers touching. Her cheeks burned. She kept her attention focused to the task at hand, but it was hard to not notice how warm his skin was and how much larger his hand was than hers. "It's really easy," he murmured. "You just turn the switch on right here and—" "Would you like me to show you?" "Sure." She continued to keep her gaze down. To her shock, his arms circled her, and he turned her body by the arms so she faced the sawhorse. Her breath caught in her throat. "Just hold the tool like so." He flipped the switch, and the saw roared to life. "Level the saw blade the angle you want." His firm instruction followed. The metal cut off the tip of the stake, sending the little piece to the ground. Chandler did the same to the other side, and soon he had a stake. "Easy peasy," he said. "Easy peasy," she murmured, even as her heart continued to slam in her chest. "Thank you," she said, or tried to, over the din. He switched off the tool. "What did you say?" She turned to him. "I said—" Her words trailed off, with their faces just a breath away. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and a sensation tugged at her. Delicious, forbidden. "Thank you," she finished before stepping away, hitting her hip into the sawhorse. "Oh!" She rubbed at the developing bruise. "You okay?" His forehead creased with concern. "Yes," she lied. No, she wasn't okay. Whatever this was, she had been a fool. Her petty little damsel in distress stunt had backfired. Badly. "Thank you for showing me how to do it." Her voice sounded amazingly calm. "You know, I could probably just finish it up for you," he offered. His voice was low and rough, making her stomach flip. "I can do it," she said in a hurry. "I'll work on it this afternoon, and then I can get the tool back to you." His lips curved into a smile. "Take your time." She turned to the sawhorses, not breathing easy until she heard his footsteps walking away from her.
Chapter 14. Chandler. Putty. That's what Chandler felt like around Darla. He could swear up and down until he was blue in the face that he wouldn't be nice to her, but there he was, ready to do anything to help her with her campaign, ready to jump at the slightest crook of her finger. Boy, was he in deep trouble. He returned his attention to his new employees working the finish on the small patio project in front of him. Jim and Paul were jockeying for position around fresh concrete. He should tell them to knock it off, but his mind still reeled from the encounter with Darla. Standing so close to her, he could smell her fragrance, their fingers touching. His body tingled at the memory. This evening would be a good time for her to return the miter when Chandler was home. Really, Chandler? He chastised himself. He was like a high school teen, crushing on a girl he couldn't have, because Darla was off limits. Once she discovered who he was campaigning for, he was sure that would be the end of her asking for his help, as it should be. The afternoon dragged as he and his crew finished surface of the driveway. Chandler directed Jim and Paul in the cleanup. They rinsed the tools, loaded them up in the bed of his truck, and headed to their separate homes. On his porch, Chandler immediately saw the object sitting there waiting for him. He parked his truck in the garage and went back to the porch. There was a note attached to the miter saw. "Thank you, Darla." He read it another time or two. It was a bit disappointing that she didn't elaborate, but what else could she have said? Was he expecting a love letter? Something like, "Dear Chandler, Thank you so much for changing my life today. Since you taught me how to use the miter, I have been making all sorts of crafts, including a huge heart that reads, Darla loves Chandler. I can't wait to see you again. I was wondering, in fact, if I could borrow another tool. Pick anything. I don't care. Just let me know when and where to show up for my private tool demo. I'll be there with bells on." Smiling wryly and shaking his head in self-disgust, he picked up the tool and made his way to the garage. He took that Saturday off for a change, taking his horse up to the mountains for a trail ride. In the span of an hour, he made it to the overlook with Rico, his black paint gelding, and looked down upon the small town of Sunny Ridge. His eyes were drawn to the west side of town. There was Mrs. Raskin's house, and next to hers was Darla's. He wondered what she was doing today. Was she working on her yard? On her campaign? The reminder of his dilemma made him sigh. The next day was Sunday, which meant dinner with the family and his rowdy brothers. For one wild, crazy moment, he pictured Darla sitting beside him at that heavy oak table, being plied all sorts of nosy questions by his brothers. She would smile politely and answer as best as she could. He'd never taken a girl before to the family Sunday dinner. His brothers would have given him, not to mention the poor girl, a hard time. None of his relationships progressed seriously enough unless he counted Sam, his girlfriend from high school. Sam was back in town helping her ailing grandma. Chandler had run into her after Sunday services recently. Maybe he could ask her out the next time he saw her. If she were still single and unspoken for, that was. If Chandler had his druthers, though, he wouldn't be asking Sam out. He'd be asking a certain lady bookkeeper instead. Maybe after the elections. That was practically Thanksgiving, a long time to wait. One of Chandler's virtues, if one could call it that, and which sometimes drove his brothers crazy, was patience. One didn't whittle a masterpiece overnight. In his line of work, he could do a rush job, but he preferred to take his time, making sure everything was just so. Chandler let his mind empty, admiring the peaceful scene below. He was glad to have his 2 employees. With the additional help, he felt like he could breathe again, enjoy downtime without guilt. They turned out better than he expected. A little rough at the edges, but time would hopefully smooth things out. Turning Rico away from the view, Chandler made his way back home. When he got to his house, his phone was ringing. He raced into the kitchen, grabbing the phone, and said, "Hello?" "Hey, dude," Royal said. Chandler caught a glimpse of his disappointed reflection in the mirrored cabinet in the kitchen. "Hey, I was thinking of making a 4th of July float. What do you think if I recruit a bunch of my rodeo clown friends and had them ride on it?" "What would be your message?" "I don't know. Vote Royal, King of the Clowns?" "That doesn't exactly sound like a good campaign," Chandler cautioned him. "I know." Royal sounded glum. "But hey," Chandler relented, "it's your campaign, man. You do you." "Okay, I'll think about it." Royal paused. "Hey, I've been calling you for a while now. Where have you been?" It could have been Chandler's chance to fess up, to tell Royal about his developing feelings for Darla. He could have said that campaigning for his best friend against the woman he was crushing on was too hard on his conscience and he needed to stay neutral. But coward that he was, he didn't. "I was working on a project," Chandler said, which was partially true. "You work too hard, Chandler. You gotta have some fun." "What, like going on a date with a beautiful woman?" Chandler joked. There was silence. "You're not still thinking of that Darla woman, are you?" "It's Darla Gregory, and yes, maybe I am." There was another prolonged silence on the other end. "Royal?" Chandler said. "I'm still here." His friend's voice sounded brittle. "You're not serious, are you?" "Actually, I am. I've thought a lot about it." "You should at least have the decency to wait until the elections play out." Chandler rubbed his nape in frustration. "Why?" "How's it going to look?" Royal shot back. "My best friend leaves my campaign to date my rival?" "I'm not leaving your campaign," Chandler insisted. You might as well if you throw your lot in with her. Listen, Chandler said, his frustration rising. Darla and I aren't anything at the moment. Then waiting won't be a big deal, will it? In his mind, Chandler pictured the next few months, a long stretch of summer into fall, almost into winter. Would it really kill him to wait? Fine, Chandler said. I can wait until after the elections. Excellent, Royal said, sounding gleeful. Thanks, my friend. Chandler hung up, feeling railroaded by his so-called friend. Why was he letting Royal control who he could and could not date? It felt good, though, to finally have the subject of dating Darla out in the open. Oh, what was Chandler doing? He groaned. Talking bad about his best friend from high school over a woman? Chandler needed to get his head on straight. The sooner, the better.
Chapter 15. Darla. July rolled around, as did the 4th of July festivities in Sunny Ridge. Darla loved the holiday. She was proud to be an American, and besides, red was a flattering shade on her complexion. With the holiday also came preparations for the parade. Darla wondered if she was going to see Chandler there. She hadn't seen much of him since he showed her how to use his saw. One time, she even considered going to the hardware store so she could run into him, accidentally. But she struck down that pathetic thought. Ugh, she wasn't that desperate. As a city council candidate, she had signed up to be in the parade, even though she had no idea still what she was going to ride in. She asked Zoot if he knew anyone who could loan her a classic car. Classic? Zoot mused, rubbing his grizzled chin. If I were you, I'd ask Royal Sutton. Anyone but him, she said. Zoot didn't miss a beat. Well, I've got an old little Volkswagen Bug that's just been rusticating in my barn. I'd let you borrow it. Darla thought about declining, but she didn't want to hurt Zoot's feelings, plus she didn't have any other options. She agreed to go see it after work sometime. As July 4th neared, however, various things popped up to make it impossible to meet up. Zoot got sick, Darla had to finish a long overdue report, until finally the week arrived and Darla accepted Zoot's offer. Her phone rang the day before the parade. You busy tonight? Ellen asked her. I'm not, actually. Good, Ellen said. My daughter Marlo entered a team at the 4th of July basketball tournament, but one of her friends bowed out. I told her I would ask you. I haven't played basketball in years, Darla said with a chuckle. You don't have to be any good, Ellen said. It's just to keep them from forfeiting. You could simply stand there and it would be enough. High standards, Darla joked. Besides, Ellen continued, it's a good way to show your Sunny Ridge spirit. I bet there will be lots of potential voters at the tournament. Fine, Darla said. I'll do it. Bless your heart, Darla. Marlo will be excited. Of course, Darla couldn't just stand at the basketball game, which was one of many held that night. She wanted to contribute. She wanted to make points. Marlo's team of 20-somethings were good, really good, however. They didn't really need Darla. But at the end of the evening, with their team trailing by 2 points, Marlo called Darla's name out and passed that ball so hard as to knock the wind out of her. Darla attempted a three-pointer, one that she didn't even have a good look at, and made it. Everyone screamed with excitement, as did Darla. She jumped and landed right on Marlo's foot. Oh no, Marlo said. I'm so sorry. It was an accident, Darla said, gasping in pain. Let me take her to the ER, Ellen said, who apologized the whole time in the car, despite Darla's insistence that it wasn't anyone's fault. The doctor on duty ordered x-rays and declared that Darla had suffered a sprained ankle. You will need to wear a walking boot, she said. Of all the bad timing, thankfully Zoot had agreed to drive his Bug at the 4th of July parade, so Darla wouldn't need to worry about that. Darla walked out of the hospital in a boot. At least you can take it off, Ellen said. In my day, we had to wear casts made of plaster. The dry skin and itching drove me crazy. I can believe it. I fashioned a scratcher out of a hanger. Ellen winked, and Darla, pictured her older friend as a mischievous girl in her youth. Just the thought of a hanger in her boot made Darla itch like crazy. As Ellen dropped Darla off at her house, Ellen asked, "Did that handsome cowboy ever ask you out?" "No," Darla said, "and probably never will." "It's a bit awkward, don't you think?" Ellen observed. "What with his best friend running against you for city council?" "Perhaps," was all Darla said, "or he could simply not like me." Ellen cocked her head. "I've seen him look at you. I don't believe that for a minute." Darla thanked her neighbor for her help and waved goodbye. Ellen was an idealist. Chandler couldn't possibly be interested in her, or he'd have at least come around since loaning her his saw. She walked into her backyard and sat on a wrought iron bench to rest her tired leg. After a few minutes, she heard the loud chirping of birds. She looked up at her back eaves and noticed the baby birds had grown big. Soon, they would have to leave the nest, and maybe, just maybe, she could knock their nest down, with the help of a certain cowboy for hire. Dream on, Darla.
Chapter 16. Chandler. At 9:30 on July 4th, Chandler arrived at the fire station parking lot. Royal had asked him to help escort his parade entry, and Chandler did one better. He invited everyone in his family who could come to ride their horses. To Chandler's surprise, all of his 6 brothers were there. Patrick, with his wife Winnie, who wore red, white, and blue sequined boots for the occasion. Sheldon, his wife, and their 3 preteen kids, Bram, Gabe, and Tammy. Widower Dylan and his 8-year-old daughter Tater. Heath and his wife Noelle, and McCoy and his wife Tori. Behind them, riding in 3 ATVs, were members of the local FFA, who would make a few bucks to poop scoop. They gathered in the shade of a couple of trees while waiting for the parade to start. Heath grumbled, "Story of our life, hurry up and wait." "The more time to visit," Noelle said, all sunny as usual. Chandler sometimes still had to shake his head in puzzlement that she and Heath, who were polar opposites, fell in love, let alone had stayed happily married. The ladies all twittered around Winnie to admire her boots. "Aunt Winnie," Tater said, "for my first horse show, will you help me with my showmanship outfit?" "I would love to," Winnie said, leaning close and tapping Tater's chin. "Go easy on the budget," Tater's dad Dylan said. "I'm not paying for patent leather boots." "She's got the basics," Winnie observed. "We'll just need to make her sparkly." Sheldon's daughter Tammy, who was close in age to Tater, asked if she could help braid Tater's horse's mane for the show. "You can do a sleepover before the first show," Tater said. Dylan and Chandler exchanged glances over Tater's head. "She's already planning Christmas," Dylan said under his breath. "She's more organized than me," Chandler mouthed back. A sleek 48 Chevy rumbled on over. Royal was in the driver's seat, wearing a western-cut sport coat. "What do you think?" he asked Chandler. In truth, Chandler thought his friend looked a little awkward and uncomfortable in his outfit, but it was his gig. Chandler supposed that some voters in Sunny Ridge would appreciate how he looked more respectable. A banner across the side read, "Royal Sutton for City Council." A nearby car backfired, making Chandler's horse jumped. He looked over and went hot and cold all over. Darla had arrived in a battered little Volkswagen Bug. Zoot, same old-timer who ran the hardware store, sat behind the wheel. On foot ahead of the Volkswagen Bug, 2 teen girls held a banner saying, "Vote Darla Gregory." "Who's that?" Dylan asked, craning his neck. Apparently he missed the wording on the banner. "Darla Gregory," Sheldon piped up. Surprise registered on Dylan's face. "Royal's rival." "I suppose you could say that," Sheldon said. One of his kids needed his help with their stirrups, so he moved away. Dylan turned to Chandler. "Know anything about her?" Did he ever? "She's stubborn. Oh, she can sure be stubborn. Think she's God's gift to man. And well, she is, kinda, with those eyes that can make a man lose his train of thought." His words trailed off when he realized Dylan was staring at him. I mean, politically, Dylan said. Oh, Chandler coughed. She's a bookkeeper, recently divorced. Got a good head on her shoulders, but very hard-nosed. Stickler for rules. Isn't that good? Dylan said, frowning. Chandler shrugged. She runs planning and zoning like she's the President of the United States. Dylan raised an eyebrow. So, who are you going to vote for? Pshaw, Chandler said. Of course, Royal. He paused. I think? Are you sure? Chandler was glad that at that moment, the parade organizer announced on her bullhorn that it was time for the parade to start. He already got a lot of guff from Royal. Chandler didn't want his family to join in on the act. The Brown family collected their horses and positioned themselves in rows at their designated parade spot. Chandler looked back in time to catch a huge plume of smoke rising over the hood of the Volkswagen Bug. Zoot got out, opened the hood, and kicked at the car. It lurched and sputtered. Zoot hurried and got in the driver's seat, revving the engine. Chandler caught Darla's gaze. He hadn't seen her in a while, and his body flooded with a feeling he hadn't felt in a long while. Happiness. He raised his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, she lifted a hand in reply. Something going on between that two of you? Dylan asked Chandler. Was his face so transparent? Chandler bowed his head and adjusted his seat in the saddle. No need to answer, Dylan said dryly. Your body language says everything I need to know. Chandler's cheeks warmed. And what do you know exactly? You find her attractive, Dylan observed. And if I do, then you'd better act on it. I can't, Chandler confessed. Dylan eyed him. What do you mean you can't? I mean, I promised Royal that I wouldn't ask her out until after the elections. What does politics have to do with that? Chandler sighed. Dylan was being daft. It's all about perception. You don't think people will talk if I'm helping Royal campaign while dating her? All's fair in love and politics. I don't think that's the actual saying, Chandler said. Dylan shrugged. Close enough. You know what I mean. Enlighten me. I mean, Dylan explained, you've got to separate those things out. You can help your friend while dating Darla. Will Royal really mind? You know how territorial Royal can get, Chandler said. Besides, no woman is worth losing a friendship over. Dylan clucked and made his horse move. It was time to get into the parade lineup. If you say so. Chandler watched his brother move away, frustrated. He'd had it all planned out, and Dylan had to plan all sorts of crazy ideas in his head. He glanced ahead where Darla was positioned in the parade. Horse entries like Royal's needed to be toward the back due to the poop scoop demands. He had a clear view of the woman who was starting to get him all shook up, night and day. At least Chandler could glance at her without any of his brothers, especially Dylan, noticing.
Chapter 17. Darla. This was a mistake. Already, smoke was starting to form under the hood of Zoot's Bug. What's going on? Darla asked. Nothing to it, Zoot said. Just burns a little oil 'cause it's got a leak in the oil pan. A little explosive sound toward the back made Darla jump. She craned her neck. What was that? Oh, that? The exhaust backfiring. Zoot glanced at her. Now, Darla, I dare say you gotta relax and start waving at your constituents. I haven't won yet, she pointed out. But Zoot was busy at the moment. The knob of his stick shift came off, and he was trying to press black electrical tape back on. She groaned inwardly. What was supposed to be a triumphant entry through her adopted town's parade was turning out to be a spectacle. In the side mirror, she watched as Chandler and a band of good-looking cowboys and cowgirls on horseback followed Royal, who was driving a beautiful classic car. Royal had surprised Darla by not dressing as a clown. He actually looked put together. Unlike Darla. Taking a deep breath, Darla forced herself to smile and wave at the crowd. She recognized a few familiar faces, mostly locals whom she had encountered at planning and zoning. some not in a favorable light. Her spirits sank. What was she thinking? Running for office? Did she have any business doing that in this one-stoplight town? Had she even formed any friendships with old-timers? When she considered zoning applications, she totally ignored an applicant standing in town. Nothing irritated her more than a fellow commissioner playing favorites. She'd ruffled several feathers because of that. Smoke was really coming up from the hood now. Zoot? Darla said, her voice rising. Zoot cursed under his breath. I suppose we ought to check that out. Right in the middle of the parade, with the high school marching band playing a festive patriotic song, Zoot stopped the bug. Zoot opened the hood and moseyed back calmly. You wouldn't happen to have a fire extinguisher on you, Darla, would you? Darla gaped at him. Why ever would I? You never know. My ma used to have all sorts of practical things in her purse. Why, one Halloween, Zoot, she said firmly. Focus. Scoot on out then, Zoot said. Let's push the car to the side. He glanced behind them. Might as well have everyone else pass us by. Smoke continued to billow out of the car. Darla bit her lip. Of all days for things to fall apart, it had to be today, in full view of the whole town, in full view of Chandler and his family. She faked a smile as people gawked at the car. On the flip side, she was getting a lot of attention onto her campaign. Well, I'll be, Zoot said. Darla looked the direction he was staring at. 4 firefighters were heading her way in a small fire pickup truck. They'd come from the back of the parade. Darla wished the ground could swallow her up. Could this get any more embarrassing? The truck zipped to a stop behind the bug. Darla craned her neck to see what was going on, but couldn't. There was a whole lot of hissing and more smoke, totally engulfing Darla's head. The passenger door was yanked open, and she was pulled out by a pair of muscular arms. She half expected her rescuer to be one of the firefighters. But no. Chandler Brown was not only holding her in his arms, he was carrying her off as though he were a caveman and she were a prize. He smelled good, wholesome, like if sawdust and hay mixed. She resisted the urge to bury her nose into the crook of his neck. Spectators clapped their appreciation and cheered, with a few catcalls thrown into the mix, some of which came from his family. She didn't dare look to confirm. They were at least 3 car lengths from Zoot's poor car. Zoot was standing off to the side, his expression crumpled. Through the vehicle's open rear hood, smoke formed a thick cloud. A couple of firefighters were holding extinguishers. Are you okay? Chandler asked her, his face just inches from hers. I think so. She felt like she'd been doing Zumba, out of breath. He raised an eyebrow like he wanted to check for himself that she really was okay. You can put me down, Darla said. I believe the crisis has been averted. Oh, of course. He set her back down to her feet and glanced at Zoot's car. What are you going to do now? Walk the parade, I guess. Might as well make the most of the attention, she smiled wryly. In that? He gave her boot a pointed look. Well, she countered, I sure wouldn't in Zoot's car. Give me a minute, he said, then dashed off to his family. He grabbed a pretty sorrel horse by the reins and returned to Darla's side. This here is Timmer. Now go on, ride him. Darla blinked. Ride your horse? Yes, I'll hold him steady. He looked behind them, where the parade had stopped. Royal was scowling in his truck. Darla couldn't believe it. Her rival's loyal friend helping her out. Swallowing her pride, she nodded. Thank you. She studied the horse, who was also giving her a side glance. Are you sure your horse will be okay with me riding him? Timmer's an old hand at parades, Chandler winked. He'll take good care of you. The wink did a number on her heart. She nodded as she willed her pulse to slow down. It took some doing for her to figure out how to put her non-booted foot into the stirrup so she could lift herself into the saddle. After a heartbeat, Chandler said, May I? He put his hands on her waist and lifted her onto the saddle like she weighed nothing. She looked down at him as he doffed his cowboy hat at her. She thought after her ex, heroes no longer existed in the world. But Chandler proved her wrong that day.
Chapter 18. Chandler. Chandler caught Royal's glare, but he had to do what needed to be done. If Royal had an issue every time Chandler looked Darla's way, Chandler had no sympathy. Darla needed help, and well, Chandler couldn't ignore a damsel in distress. He walked back over to his brothers. Helping Darla didn't have to mean that he would be associated with her campaign. Dylan gave him a knowing look. "Well now," he drawled. "That was interesting." "Now don't you start," Chandler said. To his consternation, Dylan and a few other brothers of his exchanged amused glances. Chandler was sure he wouldn't hear the end of it at their Sunday family dinner. They were all good at sticking their noses in each other's business, especially into the unmarried brothers' love lives. Chandler and Dylan were the remaining bachelors, and Dylan wasn't exactly in a hurry finding a replacement for Tater's mom, who died giving birth. Chandler made his way to the back line of ATVs and hitched a ride with a teen boy. Once in a while, Chandler looked ahead to see how Darla was doing. Timur, ever the dependable horse, made her look fabulous. The crowd cheered them along. The parade moved as slow as molasses. Zoot's bug wasn't the only one to break down in the middle of the July heat. A couple of classic cars overheated and had to be ditched at the curb. The route went down Main Street, past the grocery store, and turning east toward the high school. Chandler's ATV ride led him out at the high school, and he went in search of Darla. A crowd of horse-crazy girls crowded around Timur, admiring him. Darla stood next to Timur like a proud aunt. "There's his owner," Darla said, her eyes flitting to Chandler. They held a light he'd never seen before, a glance that made him feel a little woozy, though that could have been because of the sun overhead. Chandler approached. Timur's admirers asked lots of questions about the 10-year-old gelding. When their curiosity was finally satisfied, they scattered off. "Thanks again for letting me use your horse," Darla said. "You bet." She bit her lip. "What did Royal think of, your letting me borrow him?" He fixed his gaze on her. He didn't like it, but that's his problem. Her eyes widened. "You really mean that? How long have you guys been friends?" "Since high school. But yeah, the thing was, you needed help out there at the parade, and I could help you, so..." He shrugged. She stepped close to him so he caught a light floral scent, then planted a kiss on his cheek, rendering him speechless for a good minute. "Thank you," she said. Do you need a ride home?" he stammered. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "Sure." With his head still in a whirl over her kiss, Chandler loaded Timur in the trailer. As he drove his truck out the parking lot, he saw a glowering Royal looking out the window of his Chevy. Chandler would deal with him later. Minutes later, he pulled into Darla's driveway and turned off the engine. He turned to look at Darla, whose face practically glowed, until he realized that it could have been exposure to the sun. Still, his eyes drifted to her beautiful profile and the way a little smile hitched up the corner of her mouth. "How's the campaigning going?" he asked, and then kicked himself. Did he really need to remind her about their differences? She winced as though she was thinking the same thing. "Busy. Fun. Some people have the weirdest questions." "Like what?" "Oh, like who I voted for in the last U.S. presidential election, that kind of thing." "What does that have to do with anything?" She sighed. "Exactly my thought. I think they're trying to ferret out if I'm a Republican or a Democrat. Totally irrelevant to city council, of course." "And you are?" She swatted at his arm. "Oh, stop." So she wasn't going to say, was she? He leaned toward her to catch a glimpse of the house eaves. "How are the birds?" "Poopy and growing," she said, and they laughed. "Seriously, I can't wait to get them off my house. I hate having to clean up." "Maybe," he murmured, "I can help you with your ladder the next time." She turned to him. He had leaned so close that their faces were just a breath away. "Why are you so nice to me?" she whispered. "Am I?" he whispered back. "Aren't I the bad guy?" Helping her rival for city council? That's the thing. Her eyes scanned his face, then skittered away, making his blood hum. You're best friends with the guy, and yet here you are, giving me a ride home. Maybe I'm a nice guy. He leaned a fraction closer. Or maybe I just wanted an excuse to be with you longer. She pursed her lips and lowered her gaze before lifting it once again. Chandler, I don't think this is a good idea. He nodded. You're right. It's a terrible idea. She blew out a breath. Just my luck. A great guy comes along, the complete opposite of my ex, and he's off limits. Her eyes bugged out as she clapped a mouth to her hand. Did I just say that out loud? Came her muffled words. I'm in the same boat, he commiserated. Why'd you and Royal have to go head to head? If I'd known he was running, she cocked her head. Nah, I'd still run. Chandler scratched his nape. I should have talked him out of it when I first found out you were running. Why didn't you? I didn't think it'd be a big deal, he admitted softly. He hoped she could read his meaning between his words, but she was looking off into the distance, preoccupied. I suppose, she finally declared, we could kiss and just get that out of the way, she said. We could... What? His jaw fell open. You know, she insisted, if something's forbidden, you want it more. We'll kiss and get the temptation to date over with. He swallowed with difficulty. That sounds great, he croaked. For Royal, she said. The mention of his best friend's name took him out of the moment, but he managed to repeat solemnly. For Royal. So, she unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to him. Let's do it. Her lips were right there, in front of him, his for the taking. He suppressed a chuckle. She looked so serious. Should I kiss you or you kiss me? He teased. Hesitation crossed her face. Her gaze had lowered to his mouth, and she appeared to be having second thoughts. I don't know, she whispered. Amusement fled, replaced with a hunger that swept over him. He reached for her and pulled her close, his lips sliding over hers. He pulled back, but not too far. Their faces touched, his jaw to her cheek, the contact heated and pleasurable. He raised his fingers and trailed them over her smooth cheek. Her eyes fell shut. Then they were kissing again, arms encircling the other. Suddenly she broke off their kiss. They sat with ragged breaths in a half embrace. She looked as dazed as he felt. There, she said. There? He echoed, craving to pull her back into his arms. She nodded. You're out of my system. He blinked at her in confusion until he remembered her earlier words. Was she serious? She looked serious enough, her expression set, with only a little wobble in her gaze cluing him in that maybe she wasn't as unaffected by him as she wanted to claim. Good, he said lightly. She searched his eyes, the corners of her mouth drooping before she perked up again. She pulled out of his arms, sliding her palms on her jeans as they both settled back in their seats, apart, no longer touching, no longer hugging, no longer kissing. Chandler gripped the steering wheel with his left hand until it hurt. That should carry us through to the election, she said matter-of-factly. His shoulders sagged. That's a long time away. Anything worth having is worth waiting for. Of course, but... She put her finger across his lips, silencing him, while also making him hungry for more. But he wanted to respect her wishes, so he didn't reach out for her like he wanted. How are you going to deal with Royal? She asked. He glanced out the window, then at her. I have no idea. Talk to him, I guess. Maybe I should pull out of his campaign. He gave her a hopeful glance. Then we could see each other sooner. No, she said firmly. I've just gotten out of a bad marriage, Chandler. Her eyes begged him to understand. He pursed his lips. Okay. She turned and started fumbling with his truck door handle. Hold on, he said. He helped her out of the truck and walked her to the front porch. As she turned at her door to look at him, he tried his best to do an imitation of the puppies that his brother Heath trained, eyes sad and earnest. See you later, Chandler, she said, with the slightest hint of remorse before shutting him out of her house. Chandler shoved his cowboy hat tighter on his head, took one last look at Darla's house, and walked to his truck. The next day, his phone was ringing off the hook. He braced himself as he answered the call. Hello? Hey! What's up, Royal? Chandler asked. You know what's up. Can I come over? I suppose, Chandler hesitated. If you're going to fight me, I'm not interested. I have to check on some work my guys are doing. Gonna be leaving here soon. It shouldn't take long. Chandler was tempted to say no, but this was Royal, who sometimes could be a knucklehead but was his friend anyway. Fine. Royal arrived, slamming on his brakes hard enough to create a cloud of dust. Chandler waited for him on his front porch. Royal got out of his truck, walked around to the hood, and stood stock still when he realized Chandler was watching him. Chandler kind of hated himself at that moment. They'd had their differences in the past, but nothing deal-breaking like this. He motioned for Royal to take one of the two chairs on his porch. Royal settled in but repeated, This shouldn't take long. Chandler nodded and waited, looking out to the pasture across the street from his house. Royal took off his hat and played with it nervously. How long have we been friends now? He asked. Let's see, Chandler mused. We're 32 and we met when we were freshies at high school, so 17 years? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Royal was silent for a minute. When I saw you help Darla Gregory by offering your horse, I wanted to forget all those 17 years. I was so done with you, Chandler. Chandler took a deep breath and released it. I can see that. Royal trained his gaze on him. Do you? I actually expected you to punch me after the parade. Like I want to right now? Royal stood and balled his fists. Whoa, Royal. Chandler forced himself to sit still. Does this win mean that much to you? It's not even about that, Royal said. You'd promise me your support. Friends don't break promises. I've kept my promise. I've supported you. By drawing attention to that woman and making me look like a fool in front of everyone in this town. Well, Chandler drawled, I wouldn't say that everyone was at the parade. Not funny. Royal stiffened, then whirled around. About right now, I wanna... He punched his palm. Just think of the headlines, Chandler said. Council candidate Deck's best friend. Some best friend? Listen, Chandler stood. I've got a proposal. His friend looked at him warily. You obviously want to fight me, Chandler continued. So, we'll fight. At the Canned Cherry Cobbler Festival. Royal's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I mean, we'll fight at the canoe tipping contest in the lake. We already do that, Royal scoffed. Yes, Chandler smiled. But if either one of us loses, we also have to have something big at stake. Royal stared at Chandler. Like? Chandler thought for a minute. If you lose, you'll let Darla drive your '48 Chevy until Election Day. Royal blinked, then snorted. You've got to be kidding. Nope. I don't even let my mother ride in it. Exactly. So, deal? Depends, Royal glowered. What about you? I'll give up my hammer for a day. Some hardship, Royal said, chortling. How about something real hard? Like? You won't talk to Darla until Election Day. Chandler stopped short. No way. Then it's perfect, Royal smirked. You obviously won't want to lose. Come on, Chandler said. I've fallen for Darla. She and I already couldn't date until after the elections, and I'm going to shoot my chances with this. What if someone nabs her before I do? You're the one that proposed this, Royal countered. It was your big idea. Fine, Chandler said, determined he wouldn't lose this bet.
Chapter 19. Darla. A few weeks had gone by since Darla last spoke with Chandler, since they'd kissed. She'd resisted the urge to make a trip to the hardware store, where she very well might run into him. It was a small town, but she had no cowboy-for-hire sightings at the grocery store, which was just as well. Darla didn't want or need the temptation of seeing Chandler Brown, especially after that kiss. It was late August, and kids were heading back to school. It was sad to see summer end, but to Darla, the passing of time meant that the elections would finally be around the corner. It was both a nerve-wracking prospect and a milestone, and, of course, a possibility to date a certain cowboy, when and if she was good and ready. Darla grabbed a life jacket from the garage. She'd signed up for the canoe tipping contest at the 𝗵𝗶𝗿𝗲 Festival, summer's last hurrah, and they recommended to bringing your own flotation device. She figured this would be a good way to get her name out there. In the recent years, when she attended the festival, she had fun at the annual event. This town had its quirks, but Darla didn't mind. She was used to being looked at like she had two heads, an oddity, a woman from the city who would never belong to Sunny Ridge. It wouldn't hurt so much if not for the fact that she gave so much of herself to planning and zoning. Old-timers claimed how much they loved Sunny Ridge, and yet very few of them lifted a finger to volunteer in this one stoplight small town, where it mattered the most. Darla knew of a lady who moved to Sunny Ridge from the city and took up the thankless job of restoring the grand old opera house on Main Street. It had been bulldozed several years after the city decided it was too dangerous to keep it up and toppling over. Sadly, no one had thought to restore it. Now in its place was an exact replica that was a nod to bygone days and Sunny Ridge's pioneer history. Darla drove her little beat-up sedan to the outskirts of town, where the fairgrounds were located. It was a beautiful late summer day. The green of the fields was at its peak. Wildflowers bloomed along the road. Colorful zinnias and marigolds spilled out of flower beds. There wasn't a wisp of cloud in the sky. It was such a nice day. Darla could see clear across the pastures to the blue mountain range that surrounded this small Colorado town. For all the sadness surrounding her divorce, one thing Darla was grateful for was that her ex enticed her to live here. She passed several farm fields before finally reaching her destination. The county fairground parking was packed. It took Darla a few minutes of circling the rows before she found a spot, and it was about as far away as one could be from the entrance. But she didn't mind walking. Besides, she had put on magnetic campaign signs on either side of her sedan. Anyone driving to the festival today wouldn't miss them. She made a beeline for the pond where the canoe tipping contest was traditionally held and froze at the sight. Chandler and Royal were walking over to the staging area where several canoes were set out. Chandler turned his head and saw Darla, which caused him to stop in his tracks, stare, and smile. She smiled back tentatively. Royal's reaction was much less welcoming. He glared at Darla and turned a cold shoulder at her. Inwardly, Darla sighed. Why did Royal have to act like a jerk? Darla joined the other competitors who had gathered around the event MC to check in. She steered clear of Royal and Chandler. The last thing she wanted to do was to aggravate his royal pain. Welcome to Sunny Ridge's 10th annual canoe tipping contest. Honey, a woman with a smile equally sweet as her name said. I believe everyone is here, so we shall start. First things first, we will divide up the group into pairs. I will be drawing names randomly. She rattled off some names until only 2 canoes were left. She hadn't said Darla's, Royal's, nor Chandler's names yet. Chandler got paired with an athletic-looking woman named Berna. And what do you know? Darla was paired with Royal. Darla just stood there for a minute stewing. The last thing she wanted to do was to get in the canoe with Royal. But everyone was looking at her, so she had no choice but to go ahead and get in. Royal looked like he wanted to tip her into the water. The feeling was mutual. Royal dragged his feet over and got in the canoe, about as excited to do this as a dog going to a veterinarian. "You can't mess this up," Royal muttered. "There's a lot riding on this." "Don't worry," she said. "You don't need my help to mess up." Royal sucked in a breath and turned a narrowed gaze at Darla. "Wow, mature today, are we?" "I'm only rude to rude people," Darla smiled sweetly. It was a great bonding moment. Darla was sure that after they tipped their competitors, Royal wouldn't waste any time trying to drown her. The instructions were straightforward. The aim of the contest was to tip over as many canoes as possible. Darla counted, and there were 8 of them. The one that remained upright at the end would be declared the winner. "Okay, everyone," Honey said. "Let's not get overly friendly now. Please spread out. We don't want people clumping together. On your mark, get set, go." Darla turned to Royal. "What did you mean by saying there was a lot riding on this?" Royal frowned. "Why are you obsessing about that right now? It's time to win." He wasn't kidding. Bearing down on the others in their canoe like a torpedo, Royal orchestrated the sinking of their first casualty. He reached out and grabbed the other pair's paddle, then used it on the lip of their canoe to tip them on the farther side. Even as she hated to admit it, Royal had earned Darla's begrudging respect. He was relentless at pursuing what he wanted. The next canoe held a mother and teenage son. Darla felt bad for the mom at first, but she held her own. No worries there. Luckily, the mom gave a play-by-play which announced to Darla's team, if you could call them that, what to anticipate. "Son, rock their canoe back and forth, then tip them over. Son, steal her paddle. Son, keep pushing on their canoe with your weight." With that last instruction, the son lost his balance and fell in the water. "But we haven't been tipped over," the mom complained when Honey announced they were eliminated. "If one of you falls in, that's an automatic elimination," the MC explained. Darla exchanged triumphant glances with Royal until she remembered they were enemies. He himself looked smug, like he had done the feat all by himself. Her gaze drifted to the others. She couldn't see Chandler immediately. "Chandler's in the orange boat across the lake from us," Royal said. Darla could hear the disdain in his voice. "I wasn't looking for him," she lied. "Right," he snorted. Ugh. Darla was having second thoughts about dating any friend of Royal's post-election. They maneuvered alongside 2 canoes that were going hot and heavy against each other. In between them was a canoe helmed by a beefy man who looked like he ran Ironman routes for practice, and his daughter. The other was a couple who looked to be in their 60s. Darla was about to jump right on in, trying to grab the canoe with the Ironman dad, when Royal turned to her. "Don't," he said. Puzzled, she waited for an explanation which never came. The Ironman pair rocked their canoe. "We can't just let him do this," Darla said. "Watch from the master," Royal said. On the upswing of a wave, he reached over and pushed the Ironman's canoe so it tipped over toward the couple. For one crazy second, it looked like it would tip back toward Darla, but it didn't. Instead, it fell into the other canoe, sinking both of them. In the surviving canoe, Darla almost gave Royal a high five until she saw his "I told you so" expression. "What did I tell you?" he said. "Okay," she conceded grudgingly. "You were right. Are you impressed yet?" She rolled her eyes. "Very." For the final showdown, Chandler's canoe came into view. His gaze flicked to Darla, then Royal. Royal said, "Are you shocked we haven't thrown each other overboard yet?" "Absolutely," Chandler said. "You, however," Royal said, reaching over to pull on Chandler's canoe, "are going down." "What's at stake for both of you?" Darla asked. "What?" Frowning. Chandler looked at Royal. "Did you tell her?" "If I had," Royal said, "would she be asking you?" It was difficult focusing on what was going on. Royal was going hard to tip Chandler's canoe, but Chandler was trying to answer her question. Chandler said, If Royal loses, he'll let you drive 48 Chevy truck. If I lose, I can't talk to you. Both would be through election day." "His beautiful truck?" Darla blinked. "Whose idea was that?" "You're brilliant cowboys. Who else?" Royal said, an edge to his voice. "Don't listen to him," Chandler said, grunting as he jousted paddles with Royal. "He came up with mine. I came up with his." Chandler darted a glance at Darla. "You're more interested in his truck than not talking to me till November?" "Well, it's a cool truck," Darla teased. "I can't believe I agreed to that," Royal said. "I should deck you right now." "I want to see you try," Chandler replied. It was entirely possible for Royal to wrestle Chandler out of the canoe, as he was beefier than his friend, but Chandler was also giving his best effort. Darla looked on with alarm. She definitely didn't want Royal to win, but if Darla contributed to Chandler's loss, he couldn't talk to her for months. Darla needed to do some self-sabotage, fast. She swayed the canoe until Royal turned to her with an outraged expression. "What are you doing?" "Swamping us. What else?" she smirked. "I want to drive your truck." "Stop it," Royal said. "You're supposed to be on my team. Stop it." Darla leaned forward hard, sending the canoe on tipping into the water. Royal grabbed her, but he was too late. Darla was falling in the water, and she was taking Royal with her. Royal and she sputtered to the surface the same time. "Nice dive," Chandler said, his eyes shining with amusement. And something else. Happiness.
Chapter 20. Chandler. A week later, Chandler finished up a job with Jim and Paul. He had to run to the store to grab the right kind of screws and return to the worksite to the two bickering. Lately, Chandler had to referee the two, and he was getting tired of it. "What's the problem?" Chandler asked, looking from Jim to Paul. Paul's face was red. "Loser over here thinks he's too good to clean up." Jim's eyes narrowed to slits. "I did my part. Now you do yours." "I told you my back hurts." "Enough," Chandler glared at Paul. "This is the first I'm hearing about your back." "Just goes out once in a while." Paul's expression was mulish. "Why don't you pitch in if needed?" Chandler asked Jim. "'Cause I'm tired of being his errand boy. I wouldn't even have taken this job if it weren't for..." Jim stopped abruptly when Paul strode right up to his face. It was funny, seeing the short, squat man challenge the tall, younger dude. "Stop it right now, you two." Chandler looked around, relieved the client was out of earshot. "I don't want to hear another peep from either one of you. Go home and cool down and come back tomorrow with better attitudes. Or go find a different employer." Jim and Paul marched off to the latter's truck. That would be one rough ride, having these two at each other's throats, but that wasn't Chandler's problem. He glanced at his watch and winced. He needed to be somewhere 5 minutes ago, and was now late, thanks to the two clowns. Driving home as fast as he legally could, he changed out of his dirty overalls and drove the short distance to Royal's house. On the driveway was a small sedan. Darla sat behind the steering wheel. "Hey," Chandler greeted Darla. "Big day." "You can say that again," she grinned, making Chandler's heart skip a beat. "Big day," he repeated. Darla smiled at his attempt of a joke, and they both walked up to Royal's front porch. It was what one could expect of a bachelor rodeo cowboy. A stack of firewood looked like it could tip over any second. The upper half of a fake bull sat on the lawn, which was pretty much stripped of grass. There were gas cans and odds and ends related to cars. "He must like cars," Darla observed, as her gaze flitted from the hubcaps to the massive container of tools. "Always has," Chandler said. "Did he go to school for that?" "Trade school. I went to carpentry, he did auto mechanics. People are always asking him to restore their cars." Chandler paused, his eyes not meeting hers. It's always been his dream to run his own repair shop. Guilt tugged at Darla. "He could, in the right part of the city." He didn't say anything, refusing to start up a fight. The front door opened and Royal stood there glowering. "You gonna stand there all day?" Chandler drawled. "Or you gonna invite us in?" "Not gonna do either one." Royal stepped off the porch and waved for them to follow him. "You know to come round to the workshop." "I never know where to go here to see your cars," Chandler said. "I wouldn't put it past you to put one in your bedroom in some temperature-controlled closet." "I wish," Royal answered. He gave Darla a side-eyed glance but didn't say anything else. They walked behind Royal down a path to a huge barn. He took a set of keys from his pocket and opened the door. He continued in and they followed, Darla first, then Chandler. It was dark inside, even for a daytime tour. The kind of dark that promised spiders and all sorts of other creepy crawlies. Darla looked over his shoulder, her eyes wary, as though to ask if Royal's garage was legit. Royal walked over to the wall and flipped a switch. Shop lights in the rafters lit up the space, which was crammed with 4 vehicles bumper to bumper. At the very front was a shrouded vehicle. Royal approached it, holding a hand up as though to ask for reverence, and then he pulled back the cover. Did the guy have tears in his eyes? "This is my baby," Royal said. "I'll take good care of her," Darla promised. Royal said, all huffy, "He's a baby boy." "Okie dokie," she said, smirking. "You think I'm joking?" Royal's voice rose. Chandler walked over and pulled Royal aside. "Hard to take you seriously the way you're acting, bud." "This is your fault. If you hadn't made me make that stupid bet, I wouldn't have to be dealing with this." "Good grief, man." Chandler shook his head. "It's just a truck." "Just a truck," Royal mimicked. "Just a city council election. Just a woman you're crushing on." Chandler was sure Royal's voice carried over to where Darla stood, and he was okay with that. He didn't mind her knowing. Royal moved past Chandler, butting his shoulder against his. "Do you even know how to drive stick shift?" he asked Darla. "I did it a while back when I was starting to drive. My dad insisted we all learn how to drive a stick." Royal nodded, looking somewhat pacified. "Can I take it for a spin then?" Darla asked. Royal's eyes bugged out, like he was having a heart attack. To his credit, when he stopped hyperventilating, he responded with a faint, "I suppose." He folded back the rest of the car cover and set it aside, cringing at the sound of Darla opening the driver door. She got in and gazed at the dashboard, running her fingers along the restored leather paneling. "Beautiful," she said. "Like a baby." Royal's voice cracked. "If you're not careful, it'll break." "It's tough and you know it," Chandler said. Royal darted a dark look his way. "I wouldn't take it off-roading or nothing." "So," Darla said, looking from Royal to Chandler and back, "who's going to come with me for my first ride?" Chandler would have preferred that he go with her, just the two of them, but didn't want to suggest it and aggravate Royal further. He waited to see what Royal's response would be. Royal raked his fingers through his hair. "I probably should," he said slowly, "but I don't know if my heart can take watching you drive it." "Come on, Royal," she said. "I'm not that bad of a driver." "You were in Zoot's car when it broke down at the parade," he shot back. "Zoot was driving," she pointed out. Chandler raised his hands to calm the two. "Hold your horses. How about if I ride with Darla? I won't lose my mind over every single thing, and—" Here he looked at Royal. "You don't have to worry about your baby." Royal's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he didn't have a choice, did he? "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. With crossed arms, he watched as Darla drove the truck away, with Chandler in the passenger seat. In the next several minutes, let's just say, it was a good thing that Royal wasn't watching. Darla ground the gears a couple of times, killed the engine once at a hill, and blew past a stop sign, then belatedly slamming on the brakes. "Are you normally this bad of a driver?" Chandler asked her. "Come on, cut me some slack," she said. "I'm having to shift gears at the same time. It's been a while." Chandler smiled. She was so cute. intent on figuring out the car. Suddenly he wished that they didn't have to return to Royal, and instead they could keep driving on to town for a romantic date, or a picnic at the Sunny Ridge Overlook. "What?" Darla was looking at him, her eyebrow raised. Caught daydreaming, his cheeks warmed. "I was just thinking how funny it would be if we didn't get the truck back to Royal." "That would be mean," she said. Mischief gleamed in her eyes. "Let's do it." "Serious?" he choked out. "Well, what'll he do? Put the cops on our trail?" "I wouldn't put it past him. He'd imagine that we're in the bottom of a ravine somewhere. Never mind that we're hurt as long as nothing happens to his Chevy." "Where to then?" she asked. He pictured her lovely skin, tawny gold at sunset. "How about the Overlook?" he said. Darla drove up the road that led to one of Sunny Ridge's most romantic landmarks. Chandler wondered if she realized the significance of this spot. It was where every teen boy in Sunny Ridge dreamed of taking their date. His blood hummed with a forbidden thrill. Thanks to his crazy friend, he was spending time with this lovely woman. He knew she wasn't ready for full-on dating, so he wouldn't push it. He would simply enjoy the moment. Darla backed a few feet shy of the Overlook, downshifted, and killed the engine. She smiled at Chandler, her face full of life. "You're beautiful, you know," he blurted out without thinking. She looked pleasantly surprised, a little smile hovering over her lips, then cast her eyes down. He wondered if he should apologize, but she was already on the move. Gesturing with her shoulder toward her door, she said, "Come on." She opened her door and jumped out, making her way to the truck bed. When he joined her, she was sitting on the truck, her legs tucked close to her chest. The wind played with her hair, swirling it around her face and lips. Chandler could have stared at her all day. Instead, he averted his eyes and joined her, sitting about an arm's length. His body relaxed as he gazed over Sunny Ridge. He looked from Main Street with its rows of historic homes to the outskirts of town with acres and acres of farmland still left standing. "I can't see why anyone would want to live in a city," he said. "I did once." Her voice rang clear. "I don't miss it." "How'd you end up here?" She pursed her lips before speaking again. "Followed my ex here. The one good thing to come from our marriage." "Why did you and he—" "Sorry, I shouldn't be so nosy." "It's okay," she shrugged. "Short of it was, he cheated on me with a realtor at his brokerage, but there were other red flags, lots of them." He studied her profile. "You're better off without him." She turned to look at him, making his insides all jumbled up. She returned her gaze to the view. "Where's your family's ranch?" Chandler pointed to the right, at the pasture flanked by a curving ribbon of water. "All 80 acres. An appreciative gleam appeared in her eyes. "Such beautiful land. I can see why your family loves Sunny Ridge so much." "We sure do," he agreed. "Royal loves Sunny Ridge too, doesn't he?" Chandler's brows came together. "You think he doesn't?" She took a deep breath and expelled it. "I don't know what to think." Studying him through her lashes, she added, "I know I said some harsh things at planning and zoning about him." "I can't remember anymore," Chandler said truthfully. "Well, I did. Sometimes I can be a little bit much." Looking away into the horizon, she said in a low voice, "Also, I used to think I knew everything." He chuckled. "But I think I'm realizing I don't." "Humble, are we?" he teased. "I know, right?" She laughed, then turned serious. He felt sorry for her. She looked so torn up. "How'd you figure that out?" "I realized I had this superiority complex. I thought that newcomers are the only ones willing to fix things around here," she confessed. "That we're the only ones willing to preserve our history. But that's not true." She blew out a frustrated breath. "I can get so stuck up sometimes." Sometimes us old-timers just like to complain about how the town is growing, but newcomers like you actually do something about it."
"Thanks."
She gave him a weak smile. "This outsider doesn't usually get complimented that way." "You're welcome." "I've really respected your brother serving on P&Z, she said. "Who, Sheldon?" Chandler nodded. "He's a good egg." "We don't always see eye to eye, I will admit, but at least he's respectful." She paused. "All your brothers seem to be nice." "Just my brothers?" His mouth twitched. She gave him an impish grin, but didn't answer. After a minute, she said, "We probably should check in with Royal, prove he can trust me with his truck." "Let him sweat it out," Chandler said. "For a little bit anyway." "Okay, a few more minutes." Studying him from the corner of her eye, she asked, "How long have you and he been friends?" "I've known him all my life, but we became friends as freshmen in high school. We were both in FFA." He glanced at her. "Future Farmers of America." She smiled. "I'm not that much of a city girl, but thanks." "Sorry, I didn't want to assume." "No apology needed." She looked off to the distance, as though searching for something in the view below. "What'll he do if he can't find land to buy for his car repair shop?" "I don't know," Chandler shrugged. "He hasn't said." "In all my time on planning and zoning, I've only ever backtracked on one vote, and it was because the developer was going to sue us." He wondered where she was going with this one. "I don't think Royal's the suing type." "Just the run for city council type." "Not that either." Her eyes probed his. "He doesn't really want to run for city council?" "Oh, I think he does," he said. "But you said, was he the politician type? Not at all. He's kind of shy, if you haven't already noticed that." "Then why is he running?" She gave him a baffled look. "Revenge? Sore pride? Who knows? Royal hasn't talked to me much about this." He shifted his leg on the truck bed. "And you? Why are you running?" She gave him a tight smile. "I've paid my dues. Being on P&Z hasn't been a cakewalk, but I've learned a lot. I'd love to be the one voting for things where it really matters." "You've certainly earned it," he said. "Either that or you're a masochist." She laughed. "I think I may be both." Her whole face lit up, and he stared before wrenching his gaze away. Darla pushed off the bed and jumped onto the ground. "Shall we go back to Royal?" "No." His hand shot out to grip hers. He wasn't counting on the jolt of electricity that zapped him at the feel of her skin. "Look." They both watched in silent awe as the sun started to come down the horizon, filling the sky with an amazing light show. "Wow," she said. Their hands were linked still. He didn't look at her, but somehow he knew exactly what she was feeling. "Someday," he said, his voice gruff. "When this thing is over, I'd love to watch a lot more sunsets with you." She was silent for several seconds. Then she squeezed his hand. "Royal is lucky to have you for a friend." "I wasn't talking about Royal," he protested. Her smile dazzled him. "I know."
Chapter 21. Darla. A couple of months passed, during which Darla put up a booth at every local event she could. Every now and then, she ran into Chandler, both of them sharing a secret smile of understanding. With the weather turning cooler, summer officially turned into fall, Darla's favorite time of the year. She was ready for sweaters and anything pumpkin, soups, and leaf colors turning. October also meant she needed to get serious about getting signs out for the election. "Hi, can I help you?" A middle-aged woman greeted Darla at the copy center. "Yes," Darla said, "I need to order signs for my city council campaign." "Wait," the woman stared at her. "Are you that lady from planning and zoning?" "It depends. Who's asking?" Darla joked. The woman offered a hand to shake. Gina Alred. I came to P&Z once to get a conditional use permit for my business. No wonder she looked familiar. The two shook hands. Nice to see you again, Darla said. Likewise, Gina said. I stayed through that whole meeting. You asked tough questions of those developers. Thanks, just doing my job. I could tell that you take it very seriously. Gina cocked her head. And now you're running for city council. Yes, I am. Way to go. Who else is running? Darla pursed her lips. If Gina had to ask, why should Darla tell her? She bit her tongue. Royal Sutton, George Wendell, and Quentin Osmond. I know Royal, George, and Quentin not as much, so... Gina was back to all business. You need signs. When Darla nodded, Gina said, Got any idea of what you'd like? Actually, no, Darla chuckled. I was hoping you could advise me. Well, friend, Gina said, a sparkle in her eye, you came to the right place. Tell me what color makes you happy. Do you want the traditional red and blue? Darla thought for a moment. Red and blue were so common. Neither. Okie dokie, Gina nodded. What color would you like then? Something different. Darla's eyes roamed the copy store. I'm partial to yellow. Yellow's nice. With maybe red text so the wording stands out, Darla suggested. A half hour later, Darla had put in an order for signs, which Gina said should come in about 3 days. If you can spare it, Gina said, you can put one in my window. Gina was good for her word. In a couple of days, the signs were in, one of which was proudly displayed in the copy center's window. Darla carved out some time in her schedule to go around and visit with old-timer families to see if they would agree to put up a sign on their lawn. She came around to a street at the west side of town. Matfield Lane had on either side rows of mature trees that also gave rise to the nickname Kissing Lane. Legend had it that teens kissed behind the trees. At the end of this street sat a small white house built at the turn of the century. The owner was octogenarian Hattie Matfield. Hattie Matfield was a friend of Ellen's and was the matriarch of a well-known Sunny Ridge family. Her son was the local barber. Men went to his business, hanging out and shooting the breeze. Women, except for female stylists, weren't welcome. Was the unspoken code, like some throwback to the 1950s. Darla knocked on Mrs. Matfield's door, feeling nervous. They hadn't exactly met formally. Darla might have seen her a time or two at the P&Z meeting when the older lady had wanted to subdivide her property for Jeremy and his siblings. She suspected that the older lady knew who she was. The door cracked open, and a woman with cropped white hair was looking at her coolly. Hi, Darla said, feeling even more of a chill. Mrs. Matfield? Mrs. Matfield nodded ever so slightly. Darla pushed through, despite getting unfriendly vibes. I'm Darla. I know who you are. Great, Darla said. May I visit with you? I'm busy, came her curt response. I can come back if you'd like. Just tell me quickly what you need. The woman crossed her arms. Darla began her elevator pitch. I'm running for city council. I know. Again, that cool stare. Darla forced herself to continue. I wondered if I could put one of my signs on your lawn. Mrs. Matfield immediately said, no thanks. She sounded so sure of herself, like she'd already made up her mind, even before this visit. May I ask why? Mrs. Matfield's lips tightened. I've known Royal Sutton all my life, saw him grow up here as a young boy. I am supporting him. What campaign promises of his do you like in particular? Mrs. Hatfield crossed her arms on her chest. I don't need to know what he promises. I already know what he stands for. Which is, Darla genuinely wanted to know. I'm not exactly prepared to answer this, Mrs. Matfield said. She lifted her nose to the air. You should badger someone else. Darla faked a smile. I'm so sorry I bothered you. Me too. Mrs. Matfield's bulbous eyes grew even bigger. As she turned to walk back to Royal's Chevy truck, she froze. On the curb was Chandler's Ford. What was he doing here? Chandler got out of his truck holding a sign for Royal. Of course. Darla, he said, tipping his hat. Not surprisingly, he was acting like she was a stranger and not a woman he'd taken a Chevy out for a joyride with a week before and who'd made the mistake of spilling her guts to him. She tucked her sign under her arm, hoping he'd feel somewhat guilty. But of course, that would have been ridiculous. Was he even sensitive enough to pick up that Darla had just been rejected? Making it to her car, she didn't hurry off. She was curious to see what kind of reception he would get from Mrs. Matfield. He stood on the front porch for a minute, and then he was being ushered, all friendly-like, inside the old lady's home. Darla swallowed her disappointment, her eyes stinging with tears, before making a U-turn and hightailing it out of there. Darla got responses similar to Mrs. Matfield's as she went around, from one influential Sunny Ridge resident to another. It didn't matter that most of them had a long anecdote they recounted for Darla of the time they went to P&Z and Darla impressed them. They were supporting Royal. Never mind that Royal himself wasn't even out campaigning, or might not ever. The other two candidates had a few mentions, but not as much as Darla's nemesis. Thank goodness for some of the newer subdivisions, who were happy to not only talk to Darla, but also to take a sign. By the end of the day, Darla had one sign left, and she'd already been turned down by at least a couple dozen houses. She drove a ways down the road the direction of her house, looking around. A yard in the newer part of town caught her eye. Earlier, she had stopped here and convinced a resident to put up a sign. Now, it was gone. Darla slowed and parked at the curb. Maybe it had just blown away. However, there was nothing on the lawn but yellowing leaves. As she got out of the '48 Chevy, the wind buffeted her, chilling her to the core. The sun was going down, and on the street, porch lights were starting to come on. Knocking on the door, she waited a couple of minutes. The door opened, the female homeowner's familiar face appeared, looking guilty. "Hi," Darla said. "Remember me?" "Yes." That guilty expression intensified. "You had allowed me to put one of my campaign signs earlier. But it's not there anymore. Any idea what happened to it?" The homeowner bit her lip before averting her gaze. "I'm sorry. My husband came home and saw it. He didn't want it on our lawn." Darla swallowed her disappointment. Lifting her eyes to Darla's face, the woman said, "He'd gone to one of the city meetings, and I guess you did something that made him angry." That narrowed it down some. Curious, Darla asked, "May I ask what his name is?" "I'd rather not say." The woman slammed her door in Darla's face. Darla stood there for a good long minute, willing herself not to cry, at least not until she could go back into the Chevy. She walked down a broken sidewalk to her vehicle and got behind the steering wheel. A couple of minutes later, she was down the road, along a stretch where there were no houses. She looked in the rearview mirror, and not seeing any cars on the road, pulled over. At first, she just sat there, and then she lowered her head to the steering wheel and groaned. By accident, she hit the horn, letting out a beep. A hysterical laugh escaped her lips, after which she heard the rumble of a truck. Lifting her head, she saw a familiar Ford pickup. Oh, it was just Chandler. He was probably all out of signs, having given them by the dozens to all the residents just mentioning Royal's name. He was coming from the other direction and pulled a U-turn to park behind her. She waited for him like she waited for a cop to give her a citation, not releasing her seatbelt. When he tapped at her window, she rolled it down. "Hey," he said, looking buff in a plain black t-shirt. His arms and face were tanned, which in turn made his brown eyes almost golden. He looked like a man who did physical labor all day instead of having to go to the gym. "Hey," she said back. "What you doing?" "I'm parked alongside the road." His eyes sparkled. "That much is obvious." "It's like a metaphor in life," she said. "Not going forward or backward, just stuck in life." "Bad day, huh? What about you? Are you having fun following me around and giving out Royal signs?" "Sure am." She was perfectly fine continuing on in this playful vibe. But something in his eyes, a gleam of sympathy, a gentleness, tugged at her soul and opened up her heart. It had been a long day of not being able to give away signs that cost her a lot of money. Why was she even putting herself out for a town who obviously wasn't open to newcomers or outsiders? More importantly, why was Chandler looking at her as though he cared? "I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry," she told herself. And then she did.
Chapter 22. Chandler. The sight of Darla bursting into tears caught Chandler completely by surprise, and a lot off-balanced. He was bent at the waist, leaning into the open window, unsure what to do. In the back of his mind, he was remembering his promise to his buddy Royal about not helping Darla campaign. Would it count if he played therapist to her? Deciding that this was an entirely different and exempt scenario, he walked around the Chevy and got into the front passenger seat, shutting the door. Darla lowered her hands from her tear-streaked face and cried even harder. "You're not supposed to be seen with me," she sobbed. "I'm not supposed to campaign for you," he gently corrected her. "Same difference," she said, hiccuping. He didn't argue. She seemed past the point of reason. Facing forward, he simply waited. Eventually, her sobs subsided. She reached for a tissue in her purse and blew her nose. "Sorry," she said. "That was embarrassing." "No biggie," he said. "I'm sure you had a good reason for it." "It's actually rather trivial," she said, sniffling. "I was crying over a campaign sign." When he stared at her with a question in his eyes, she recounted what happened. "Some people don't like me very much for being on P&Z. "Some people admire what you're doing on the P&Z, he said. "Pshaw," she waved her hand. "So what? I mean, they don't want my signs. They want royals from you." "Come on. You've got signs all over the place," he said gently. "You noticed?" Of course I noticed. He noticed everything about her. She blinked, her eyes puffy and red, and still, she was beautiful. "Which camp do you belong to?" "I've never not liked you for your work with the city," Chandler said. "I might not agree with how you vote sometimes, but I think you do a good job. Truth is, I think you're cool." She blushed. "Thanks." Her smile wobbled. "I'm sure Royal agrees." He thought about this for a minute. "I think deep down he does." She gave him a skeptical glance, then looked at his shirt. "Where were you coming from?" "Just finished taking a lady's yard junk to the dump." She crinkled her nose. "You do everyone's dirty work?" "You put it that way, and I guess I sort of do, don't I?" "And you're done for the day?" "Yep. Why?" "Oh, nothing," she said, sounding embarrassed to be asking. For one tempting moment, he wanted to ask her out to dinner. Was that what she was thinking too? Maybe they could do takeout. Then they wouldn't have to be seen around town and have that tongues wagging. Right. Sneak around, Chandler, why don't you? "What?" she asked, watching him with interest. I hope you're feeling better." Good save. She took a deep breath. "I do. Thanks for listening." With them sitting in close quarters, her low voice and their honest conversation, his chest burned with a new, deeper feeling toward Darla. He raised his hand to touch her face, until he remembered his promise to Royal. He patted the steering wheel just above where her hand rested. "You are welcome." As he drove home, he shook his head. He wished seeing Darla didn't need to be so complicated. Suddenly, he had a stroke of inspiration. He thought of Sunday dinner with his family, a standing tradition among the Brown brothers, their families, and Pops. If someone else in the family could invite her, it wouldn't be a date, but he could still have a meal with her. He was curious to see if she would get along with his family. At his house, he got on the phone to Sheldon. "You okay?" Sheldon asked. "What do you mean?" Chandler said. Well, you never call unless you're in trouble. That's not true. I call you on your birthday. Sometimes. Yeah, like every 3 years. What's up? Chandler cleared his throat. You know Darla from P&Z? Of course, why? Well, I was talking to her today, and she's having a rough go of her campaign, and, well, I was wondering if you could, help me. There was a commotion in the background, and Chandler could hear giggles amidst Sheldon saying, "No running in the house, kids." Anyway, Sheldon said, "Doing what?" "Invite her to Sunday dinner?" "Our family Sunday dinner?" "Is there any other kind of Sunday dinner?" Chandler said. "Why me?" Sheldon asked. "Well, you know her in P&Z. Yeah, but just in a working sort of relationship. I mean, we hardly talk, really." "Althea could invite her." "She would in a heartbeat, even for no reason but to feed one more person. Why don't you invite her?" "Wait a minute." He paused. "You sweet on her?" "Sort of," Chandler admitted. "Huh, interesting. Isn't your best friend running against her?" "Yep," Chandler sighed, "which is actually a big reason why I thought someone else from the family could ask her to come. I promised Royal I wouldn't ask her out until after the elections. Technically speaking, I wouldn't be asking her to Sunday dinner, so it wouldn't be a date. You catch my drift?" "Sounds messed up, brother. You ought to shoot straight with her. None of this roundabout stuff." "Don't worry. After the elections, I plan on asking her out, but until then..." "Royal's got you under his thumb?" "Course not." "I don't know, it sure sounds like it." "Sheldon, come on. Could you please stop analyzing and just say yes to this small favor?" "It ain't exactly small, but all right, I'll put a bug in Althea's ear." "Thanks. I owe you one." "You better believe it." There was a smile in his older brother's voice. "Actually, now that I think about it, this'll be pretty entertaining." He chuckled. "My brother, in love." "Hush now," Chandler said. But as he hung up, he caught a glimpse of his glowing face in the mirror. Wouldn't you know, his brother seemed to be onto something.
Chapter 23. Darla. On Friday afternoon, Darla's phone rang. "Hello, Darla. This is Althea Brown, Sheldon's wife." Darla looked at her phone receiver in surprise. She'd met Althea at some city functions before, but they weren't exactly pals. "Hey there. I was calling to see if you would like to join our family for Sunday dinner." "Dinner?" she echoed, surprised even more. "Sunday." "Yes," Althea confirmed. The invitation was odd, but sweet. "Is there a special occasion?" "No, not really," Althea said. "Just Sunday dinner." "Sure. What would you like me to bring?" "How about a salad?" "Okay, so it's you and your husband plus your 3 kids, right?" "Actually, it's the whole Brown clan, Sheldon's brothers and their families. So Chandler will be there." Darla blurted out, "Yes, Chandler will be there." Did Chandler put her up to inviting Darla? Odd that he hadn't done the inviting himself. "Is that okay?" Althea was asking. "Of course. Good," Althea said, sounding relieved. "I wondered if maybe you and he are at odds with each other, over his best friend and you running against each other." "Oh, that," Darla said airily. "I certainly don't want there to be any awkwardness," Althea said. "That's nice of you to say," Darla said, "but it'll be fine." After they hung up, Darla sat there with all these questions swirling in her mind. Was this Chandler's idea? Would they sit by each other? Why did Althea, whom she hardly knew, invite her? All day Saturday, as she raked leaves in her yard and cleared wilted flowers, she thought of the Sunday dinner. When Sunday evening rolled around, she felt like she was in a tizzy, unable to sit still for a minute. She made her potato salad and had to sit on her hands for a good 15 minutes before it was time for her to have to go. She was excited at the prospect of being able to see inside a working ranch house. As for meeting Chandler's family, she was a lot nervous. Entering Travis Brown's drive, she slowed to appreciate the picturesque scene. A modest 2-story house, hewn from rough logs, with miles and miles of space and sky around. Horses grazed in fenced pastures, and a couple of Australian sheepdogs greeted her as her car came to a stop. On the front porch, sitting in a rocking chair, was Chandler. He stood and came over as she got out of the Chevy. "Fancy seeing you here," she joked. He gave her a sheepish smile. "Glad you chose to come." "I admit it was an interesting invitation," Darla said, hoping he would take the hint and tell her what was going on. With an air of mystery, Chandler simply smiled, motioning for her to enter the house. "Let's have you meet the family." Darla had seen his cowboy brothers before, around town and at the parade, and of course, she knew Sheldon. However, this was the first time she'd actually talked to them up close. They all seemed to have gotten their good looks from their dad, who was introduced to her as Pops, and their late mother, whose portrait riding a horse hung over the fireplace. There were a couple of pregnant wives, as well as 4 grandchildren who were in their pre to early teens. It was a little overwhelming meeting all these personalities in a spacious but full family room. Throw in a few farm dogs, and it was a recipe for chaos. There was a light touch on her arm, Chandler guiding her to one of 2 long gleaming hardwood tables decked out with little gourds and autumn leaves. "So pretty," she commented. Patrick, the oldest brother, put an arm around a stunning redhead, whose name Darla recalled was Winnie. "Handiwork of my amazing wife," he drawled. Winnie rolled her eyes, but she was beaming. Patrick leaned over and kissed her, to catcalls among the brothers. Chandler's eyes met Darla's, making her pulse race at the memory of a kiss. Pops took his place at the head of one table and motioned for everyone to take their seat. "This family's bursting at the seams, and I love it." He glanced at Darla. "And today, we have a new face. Well, maybe not new to some of you." He gave Chandler a pointed look. "It's so good to see you here, Darla. Sheldon's told us good things about your work on P&Z. "Thanks for having me," Darla said, feeling a little self-conscious about all the pairs of eyes studying her. "Are you Uncle Chandler's girlfriend?" a girl who looked to be about 8 years old said, cracking everyone up. "Tater," her dad Dylan said. "What did I tell you about being nosy?" Darla smiled. "It's okay, we're just friends." Chatter about Chandler needing to get his act together ensued. Chandler flashed her an apologetic smile. Pops held up his hands, and the din died down. "Why don't you offer a blessing on the food, Chandler?" he asked. Those who wore hats took them off, bowing their heads. Darla closed her eyes, a wave of pleasure washing over her at the sound of Chandler's deep voice. "Dear Father in heaven," Chandler said, "we thank thee for thy bounty at this Sunday dinner, and for our growing family and circle of friends. We thank thee for Pops and ask that thou will continue to bless him with good health and happiness. And if it is thy will, please bless all of us in our righteous desires, so we could be an instrument of thy peace. Amen." A resounding chorus of amens followed, and then, after a go signal from Winnie, a free-for-all erupted, with lively conversation flowing as food got passed around the tables. "That was a beautiful prayer," she complimented Chandler, who was sitting to her right. "I was thinking of you," he said. When she gave him a quizzical look, he added, "If it's meant to be, you'll win your council race." "What about your pal Royal?" she teased. "If it's meant to be, he'll win," he smiled back. "You guys talking politics?" Sheldon said from across the table. "Just about her campaigning," Chandler explained. "Like telling people to vote for her?" Tater asked. "Exactly." Her dad Dylan ruffled her hair. "So, are you all voting for Darla?" When the room turned silent, Tater looked around. Though Darla appreciated the little girl's spunk, she felt bad that everyone had been put on the spot. I guess it depends how your Uncle Chandler feels about it, Patrick said, looking at his brother. There's some good candidates, Chandler said in a light tone. Darla's got a great head on her shoulders, but you all know Royal, too. That was a non-answer if I ever heard one, Heath said, slipping a piece of meat to a dog at his feet. I saw that, his wife Noelle said, swatting at his arm. Althea stood and smiled brightly. How about some dessert? Darla was grateful for the change of subject. Althea winked at her. Want to come help me bring them out, Darla? Staring back in surprise, she jumped to her feet. Sure. As Darla entered the kitchen, the sweet aroma of caramel hit her. On the counter were at least a couple dozen caramel apples dipped in various colorful candies. There were gummy worms, Oreos, peanuts, and sprinkles, all mouth-watering. Oh, wow, Darla breathed. How fun. Don't you just love fall? Althea said, beaming. Uh-huh. Althea rooted through the cupboards and took out cookie sheets. You've been here for several falls now, yes? 5. Really? Althea glanced at her. I've been here about that long? It was Darla's turn to be surprised. I had the impression you grew up here. Nope, Althea set trays on the counter. I just married an old-timer. Well, yeah, I know that. I think I'll be a newcomer for as long as I live, Althea smirked as she set one caramel apple at a time on the trays. Tell me about it. The women laughed. Can I help put them on? Darla offered. Sure. Darla washed and dried her hands, then set out to work. You and Chandler are cute, Althea said as one tray got done. Feeling a blush come on, Darla simply smiled and kept her head down. Althea leaned against the counter watching her. Are you two dating then? Absolutely not, Darla was quick to answer. We had a bit of a rocky start, to be honest. I voted down his best friend's permits and then ended up running against each other. Not exactly a good setup for 𝗵𝗶𝗿𝗶. Hey, I watch a lot of Hallmark movies. That's a great rom-com setup. Well, Darla said, wincing, my divorce just got finalized at the start of the summer, so I'm taking my time. Ah, sure, I understand. Don't want to be jumping from the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. You're being smart. Althea paused. Not going to deny it, though. I'm rooting for the two of you. Chandler's a sweetheart, in case you haven't discovered that yet. Not at first, she said, shaking her head at the memory. But yes, he is. Don't let his preoccupation with his work discourage you, Althea winked. He's hankering to settle down. I think just waiting for the right woman. He'd be a catch for someone, for sure, Darla said, hoping Althea would take a hint that things weren't quite as settled as she made it sound. Althea gave her an admiring glance. And you're a beauty with brains. I can see why Chandler's got stars in his eyes. Darla protested with a laugh. Oh, please, he does not. I beg to differ. Althea bustled about and gestured to the trays. Pick yours out, then we'll bring the rest to the others. I don't know, Darla said, racked with indecision. I kind of want all of them. Althea grinned. Well, you could certainly have 2 if you want. I'll go with the M&Ms. Good choice. When they rejoined the others to the enthusiastic oohs and ahs over the caramel apples, Chandler leaned over as Darla took her seat. Had a good chat with Althea? Yep. About what? No sense keeping it a secret, Darla decided. About you and me. His happy expression gave her almost as much pleasure as her first bite of her caramel apple. As dessert wound down, Chandler pulled something out from his pocket, his hands working at whatever it was. After a minute, Darla could see he was whittling some wood with his knife. What are you making, Uncle Chandler? Tater asked. Not sure yet. It depends. On what? The little girl asked. Chandler shot a glance Darla's direction. Depends on what our guest wants. Ooh, Tater said, her frank gaze appraising Darla. What do you want? Darla was surprised and touched by Chandler's gesture. I don't know. Can he do animals? Sure he can, Tater said with so much confidence, which Darla thought was so adorable. How about a mama swallow and babies then? Darla said. Chandler's eyes gleamed. I'll do my best. As he worked on his masterpiece, Darla enjoyed her caramel apple silently, listening to the banter around her. She could tell right away that this family loved each other greatly. There wasn't a hard edge to the teasing. Her eyes kept going back to Chandler, who was deep in concentration. A warm feeling blossomed in her chest as she recognized, almost with envy, that here was a human who had found his true passion and used his talents for good. Darla was happy as a bookkeeper, but numbers didn't inspire passion or romance, though they told a story. He glanced up and caught her looking, which made her blush. "What?" he said. Perhaps if they weren't surrounded by his family, she'd have been bold and said, "You're cute," or "I love the way you're so focused on your work." But other ears were undoubtedly listening, and she simply smiled and shook her head. Chandler's nieces and nephews crowded him, so she couldn't see how the birds were coming along, but by the sounds of their pleased comments, she knew she would be in for a treat. "Is it ready?" Tammy asked. "I think so," Chandler said. The children parted and turned to Darla to watch her reaction, she supposed. Chandler made an offering gesture with his palms up. "Oh," Darla said, gasping. "Chandler, that's beautiful." He had taken the raw wood and somehow coaxed a mama bird feeding 2 baby birds a worm. The surface looked like feathers, tiny crisscross cuts on the wood. The whole thing looked amazingly real. "Glad you like it," he said, handing it to her. "It's mine?" She raised her eyes to his. "If you don't want it," Tater said, "I'll take it." Darla laughed, then considered the little girl. "You know what? You can have it." She darted a glance at Chandler. "It's yours to give away or keep," he said, like he meant it. "I want Tater to have it," Darla nodded. "Why does she get to keep it?" Tammy said with quivering lips. Dylan and Sheldon got involved in a discussion for a moment, trying to pacify everyone. Darla felt bad for causing some hurt feelings. "Don't worry," Chandler told Tammy. "I'm going to make you a bird one, too. Your choice." "Yay!" Tammy skipped away to eat some more of her caramel apple. Darla lifted her eyes to Chandler's, who was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. For a second, it was as though the world fell away, and it was just the two of them. Just a tiny little thing, a few minutes of his time, whittling the birds, and it was enough to open a whole window into Chandler's family, into his soul. Afterward, Chandler walked her to the front porch. Amazingly enough, they had it all to themselves. The family all stayed behind in the house. Here, it was quiet. "Thanks so much for inviting me," Darla said, peeking at Chandler from behind the porch pillar. His eyes gleamed in the deepening darkness. "You mean Althea, right?" "Right. Glad you could come. And that sculpture. Wow, I'm blown away by your talent." She watched him, part of her face in the shadows. "Did you ever think of doing that instead of carpentry?" "Early on, I might have. But you know what? I get to do artistic stuff every time I have to work with my tools. Really, I can't complain." "You have a beautiful family," she said. "They're a keeper, that's for sure. You're lucky." Sounding wistful, she looked away. "What about you?" he asked. "I haven't heard you talk about yours." "What's there to tell?" She hid her face behind the pillar. "I'm not very close to my parents. My dad drank a lot when I was younger. He doesn't now, but all that past stuff got in the way of having a good relationship with him. I have an older sister who worships the ground Dad walks on." The memory brought a bitter smile to her face. "Mainly to get on his good side. My parents moved back east so they could live closer to my sister and her kids. She's also divorced." "I'm sorry," he said softly. "It's okay. Sorry I blabbed about all that. More than you wanted to know, I'm sure." "It actually helps me better understand you." "Why I can be such a pill?" She chuckled. "I took after my dad, I guess." His footsteps were slow and measured as he approached the pillar. At the feel of his fingers covering hers, Darla sucked in her breath. "I know you've told me to wait until after the election," he murmured, "but I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she whispered back. "I'm in love with you." His voice, his words made her weak at the knees. His touch made her whole body tingle. I think about you all the time. I want to be with you, to hold you. His voice deepened. To kiss you. Chandler, she said, as her entire being warmed from his words. I know, sorry. Darla, She looked around the pillar at him. A raw hunger was clearly etched on his face. Despite all her misgivings, she was drawn to him too. She leaned close to him, her eyes fluttering shut. At the touch of his lips on hers, she shivered with intense pleasure. The pillar was in the way. She needed to skirt past it and fall in his arms. The porch light came on, and they sprang apart. The kids ran out of the house, swarmed around them, then continued on into the darkness. I should go, she breathed out, before he could actually take her into his arms, before insanity took over her. I'll walk you to the truck, he murmured, already walking around the pillar. No, please. She held a hand up. It's all right. I don't have far to walk. If she were to let him come any closer to her and farther from the house, she was sure more madness would ensue. Good night, and thanks again. Good night. His eyes glimmered. She turned, walked down the porch steps, and made her way to 𝗖𝗂𝗋𝗋.
Chapter 24. Chandler. It had taken every ounce of his self-control to not follow Darla down the steps to her truck, pull her into his arms, and to kiss her some more. After she left, his mind and heart reeled from their tender exchange. He knew he couldn't stop at dating her. He could totally picture her coming to Sunday dinners and more. Just another week, and all this craziness would be over. He pulled into his driveway and parked his truck. Glancing at the house, he frowned. Odd. He thought he had left all the lights off when he had gone to church that morning. He got out of the truck and let the door shut quietly. As he circled his vehicle's hood, he noticed something silver gleaming on the ground. A bicycle, lying on its side. His senses went on high alert. He recognized that bike. Jim rode it on days when he couldn't hitch a ride from his cousin. Chandler's eyes flicked back to the light upstairs. In an instant, it turned off. Moments later, a light turned on downstairs in the kitchen. Jim was going through his house, and probably not for snacks in the pantry. Chandler clenched his jaw. Jim had been acting strange lately, showing up late. He had started off so dependable. Disappointment pooled in his gut. Had Jim relapsed on drugs? Was that why Paul and he were always bickering and on edge? He opened the kitchen back door quietly and let himself in. He had no plan other than to possibly subdue the guy until he could call the cops. The kitchen was empty and had no signs of disturbance. He started to walk toward the phone on the wall of the kitchen when the sound of a footfall stopped him in his tracks. From the shadows of the living room, Paul emerged, holding a knife in his hand. "Paul?" Chandler gasped. "Hello, boss?" Paul's entire being seemed to crackle with nervous energy. His eyes held a chillingly cold expression. "Too bad you had to come home early." Chandler heard a noise and turned. Behind him, coming from the kitchen, was Jim, whose hands were shaking. "Paul," Jim said, his speech slurred. "What are you going to do?" "Shut up," Paul said. "Just do as you're told. Did you get the money?" Jim held out a pouch that Chandler used to make deposits. There wasn't very much of value there. Maybe checks, but that wouldn't last them long. But he didn't tell him that. "Just take what you want," Chandler said, "and never show your face at work again." Paul laughed harshly. "You think I'll fall for that? I'm not as gullible as you, thinking Jim's the problem. Far from it. That's the nice thing, ain't it, having a cousin so dependent on drugs? He's going to do everything you tell him to." "Jim," Chandler said as calmly as he could, "you don't want to do this." "You're right," Jim said, his eyes wild. "I don't want to, but I gotta." "You were doing so good," Chandler said. "I even thought about giving you a raise." Don't listen to him, Paul hissed. Get the rope and tie him up. Suddenly, the doorbell sounded throughout the house, making all three jump. Who's that? Paul said, swinging his knife toward the living room. I have no idea, Chandler said. Hey, Chandler, Royal shouted outside. I know you're in there. Open this door. He sounded angry. Chandler was both relieved and worried. Relieved to have someone else here, possibly to help him, and worried that Royal would get hurt too. It's my friend Royal, Chandler told Paul. He knows I'm home. If I don't come to the door, he'll come around and let himself in. Then there will be two of us. Go now, while you have a chance. No. Jim's eyes darted around nervously. You're going to open the door and tell him to go away. What if he doesn't? Just do it, or Jim's going to kill you, I swear. Won't you, Jim? Jim bit his lip and wouldn't look Chandler in the eye. Chandler gauged his chances of subduing a strung-out druggie and a cornered Paul versus seeing how this played out. He decided to go with the second option and hope for the best. Chandler moved to the darkened living room and turned on the front porch light. Opening the door, he faced a glowering Royal. Some friend you are, Royal said. You told me that you'd lie low with that woman, but now you've got your whole family eating out of her hand. Chandler was surprised that his voice stayed so calm. He positioned his body so he could partially be outside the door, ready to run if needed. Royal, right now's not a good time. Oh yeah? Royal huffed. You can't bluff your way through this. I passed your pop's property and saw my Chevy. Talk about a blow. My friend was lying to me all along. Chandler considered his options. He could keep Royal talking until he had a plan in place. Fine. I want her to win. Satisfied? Royal's eye twitched. So you're just going to throw away our friendship for a woman after all? Only because she's the better candidate. Why, you rotten! Royal rushed Chandler, shoving him backward and onto the floor. The movement knocked Chandler into the door, which swung open. As the two wrestled on the carpet, they looked up to see Jim staring at them with his mouth gaping open, the knife in his hand. What the? Royal began as Chandler sprang from under his friend's weight and onto his feet. Royal scrambled to a standing position too. Royal, these are my ex-employees. They're done burglarizing my house and are on their way out. Aren't you, gentlemen? A light of understanding gleamed in Royal's eyes. He flexed his muscles, a throwback to his days as a wrestler in high school. Don't just stand there, Paul told Jim. Attack them! Jim grunted and attempted to rush Royal, but Royal dodged him, like a bullfighter. Chandler wanted to laugh hysterically, though he recognized this was no laughing matter. But seeing Royal come to his defense in the most natural way he knew how made Chandler happy. Jim looked at Royal and Chandler and hightailed it through the living room, or tried to anyway. Royal was quicker, grabbing the back of his shirt and pinning him to the floor. Jim thrashed around, but Royal overpowered him. Paul, meanwhile, was so caught up watching them, he didn't see Chandler sneak up from behind and put him in a headlock. Paul dropped his knife, which Chandler kicked Royal's direction. Royal used the rope that he found in Jim's pocket to tie him up first, and then Paul, who put up more of a fight but eventually gave in to Royal's expert rope-tying skills. What were you going to do? Chandler asked Paul. Leave on a getaway bike? Paul growled. That was to throw you off my scent, pin the crime down onto Jim. Jim kicked Paul hard on the nose. Ow! Paul yelled. You broke my nose! Come here, Jim said, so I can break more than that. I'll call the police, Chandler told Royal. Yes, you do that, Royal said, keeping the other two immobile under his bulk. An hour later, the police came and apprehended Jim. After taking their statements, the police left. Chandler sat on the couch and Royal on the love seat, still wired from all that adrenaline. Thank you, Chandler said. For what? Royal's voice was gruff. For saving my life. You could have done it by yourself, Royal said, waving off the compliment but looking pleased. You'll probably win the election hands down, Chandler said. I can already imagine the headlines. Council candidate squashes burglary. Ha, that'd be cool. Royal's eyes narrowed. Wait, I gotta clear something up. Did you mean what you said about Darla being a better candidate? I was trying to get a rise out of you, Chandler admitted, so you would do exactly like you did. Well, it worked. It did, didn't it? Chandler grinned and Royal smiled back. The guy stood no chance, Royal said. I guess my timing was pretty good, huh? Yep. But really, do you think Darla should get the job? Listen, Chandler said, I won't BS you. Do I think she'd be great? Sure. Does she want it more than you? Probably. But you're my friend, so I hope you'll do well too. What a cop-out answer, Royal snorted. But thank you. That's what friends do, Chandler shrugged. Hey, Royal rubbed his nape. I've been thinking. Dangerous thing, Chandler joked. I know. Well, it's this. Until tonight, I was mad at you for taking Darla's side. I'd been sore because I wanted to win so bad. Well, I think I've been doing it for the wrong reasons. He looked down at his hands. I simply wanted to punish her, to make her regret she'd turned down my permit. No kidding. Seriously, though, Royal hung his head. You're right. She's the better candidate. She actually loves this stuff, whereas I don't. I'll probably win and then sit there miserable through meeting after meeting. He winced. You know me. I like doing things outdoors, not politicking. Yeah. And then tonight happened, Royal continued. And well, it's like I saw my best friend's life flash in front of my eyes. You and I have been friends for a long time. If something had happened to you... Royal sniffled and turned away. If those two stooges could stand by each other in crime, surely I could stand with my best friend, knuckle-headed as he is. Chandler's heart pounded. What are you saying? What I'm saying, genius, is I'm going to pull out of the race and endorse Darla. And yes, Royal rolled his eyes, you can date her. Wow. Chandler stared at Royal. That's awfully big of you. Royal raised an eyebrow. Are you being sarcastic? Partially yes, partially not. I mean, you just declared a lot of important things, and the election's only a week away. It's all hardly an emergency. Royal shrugged. Better late than never. So, are you still inviting me to your wedding? First I gotta date the gal, Chandler grinned. I might try to persuade her before the election. Very tempting. Good luck, you buffoon. Come here, you big lug. The two hugged and flashed each other embarrassed smiles. Chandler went over to the phone and started to dial Darla's number. Do you want to tell her the good news, or shall I? Chandler asked Royal. You can, Royal mock glared. And if she can give back my truck early, that would be appreciated.
Chapter 25. Darla. Darla jumped off the couch as soon as she heard the sound of Chandler's truck pulling up at the curb in front of her house and the engine being killed. He had called to tell her, mysteriously, that he had some news that couldn't wait until the morning. He had simply said, news, not indicating good nor bad. As a result, she worried herself into a tizzy, wondering all sorts of horrible scenarios before trying to, half unsuccessfully, shut them off in her mind. She opened the door and stood waiting anxiously until he reached her. As he approached, she saw a bruise on his eye. "Oh no," she cried out. "What happened to you?" "Oh, this..." He raised his hand to his face and winced. "I had to fight off my employees who had broken into my house tonight." "What?" She put a hand to her mouth. "Would you like to come in?" "Sure." He followed her to the family room. As she turned, she saw him looking around. "Your house is beautiful." "Thanks. It should sell pretty well," he said. "I hope so, if those birds could only go away." She sat on the sofa and motioned for him to sit. When he did, she invited him to give her all of the night's details. Darla went through all phases of emotions as he recounted what happened, ending with laughter at Royal foiling them with his bullfighting. "He's some friend, isn't he?" she said. "You're lucky. In so many ways. Actually, that's what I've come to talk to you about." Darla's stomach fell. So that was it. He'd come to tell her. He had come to his senses, and his friendship with Royal meant so much more than whatever it was he and Darla had. "I see," she said brightly. "Well, I totally understand if you wouldn't want to associate with me anymore. You owe him your life." Chandler blinked. "What? You came to tell me that Royal's more important than what we could have?" "No," Chandler blinked. "Not at all." Her breath caught in her throat. "Then what?" His eyes ensnared hers, rendering her incapable of looking away. "He's pulling out of the election." "He is?" Chandler nodded. "He plans to endorse you." Darla sat there for a stunned minute. "Well?" he asked. Darla got to her feet and raked her fingers through her hair. "Well, that's just my luck." "I don't understand. I thought you'd be happy." She squared her jaw. "I wanted to win this election fair and square. Granted, Royal could be a pain, but he was a worthy adversary. Now everyone's going to say I only won because he got out of the race." Chandler raised an eyebrow. "You want him to not quit?" "He needs to stay in the race, yes." "What if he really doesn't want to be on the council? He says he would hate going to meetings all the time." "But won't he want to be able to push his repair shop through?" "From what I understand, he couldn't vote for his own project," he said. "I guess." She still felt glum. "It's just a bummer. Imagine campaigning to beat someone for months, only for it to come to this." "If he were to pull out," Chandler said, smiling, "we could go on a date much quicker, as early as tomorrow." "Is that all you can think about?" she said. The light went out of his eyes, and his smile faded. "I thought maybe you'd be excited about that. Obviously not as excited as I am." "I'm sorry," she said. His gaze bore into hers. "Is the election all you can think about?" he said softly. She blew out a breath. "I'm so sorry. I'm so competitive. I can think of nothing else. You're right. This campaign has turned me into a witch." A little sob escaped her throat as she covered her flaming cheeks with her hands. Moments later, Chandler was prying her fingers gently away from her face. "Hey," he said. With her gaze, she silently pled for his forgiveness. "I love you," he said, giving her a crooked smile. Was she ready for love? Would she ever be ready? She didn't truly know, but this much she knew. She would be a fool to let this cowboy go. He was a loyal friend to the end. How much more would he be loyal as a lover? "I love you too." When the world didn't implode, she smiled. Yes, that felt right. His smile spread wider, his lips trembling. Joy spread throughout his very being, and it spilled over to her and into her heart. He let her hands go and gently cradled her face in his grasp. And then he was kissing her, softly and gently, and with a growing hunger that matched hers. Afterward, he held her in his embrace, his hand trailing sparks on her arm. "So does this mean that you'll help me get rid of my bird nests?" she asked. "For a fee," he teased. "Oh, and what would that be?" "This," he said, brushing his lips against hers. "And this, and this." Each kiss made her yearn for more. She parted her lips eagerly, more than happy to oblige. Epilogue. Darla. January, 7 weeks later. Admittedly, Royal's last-minute pullout of the election stung. Darla had been raring for a fight, wanting to earn the council seat fair and square. But she was glad that at least Royal acknowledged he really had no interest in meetings. Maybe he was smarter than she gave him credit for. As her first official city council meeting ran on over 3 hours, she started to question her sanity. She looked over at the audience, her eyes meeting her boyfriend's. Chandler smiled warmly, turning her insides into mush. "Councilwoman Gregory," Mayor Spillman said, "we are ready for your vote." She cleared her throat. "Aye." "Thank you," the mayor said. As the meeting wound down, Darla thought back to Royal's petition, the one she'd voted down. Someday, it might come across their desk once again. She might have a change of heart. It remained to be seen. Royal and she were slowly warming up to each other, with Chandler, their referee. After the meeting, she walked into the frigid January night, holding hands with Chandler. She stopped to admire the stars in the moonless sky. "You did great in there, Councilwoman Gregory," he said, pulling her to him and kissing her temple. "Thank you," she melted into his embrace. "Could you tell I was nervous?" "Not at all. You sounded like a pro." "Ha ha, right. Seriously." He tipped her chin up. "You reasoned things out well and listened to the others. You had some tough things to vote on. Royal dodged a bullet, I think." She chuckled. "Thanks, I think." "I am so proud of you," he said, his thumb brushing her lower lip. She sucked in her breath and willed for him to put his lips on hers. Like the sweet cowboy he was, he leaned close and kissed her for a long, long time. The end. This has been A Cowboy for Hire, Riverdale Ranch Romance, Book Number 8. Written by Jewel Allen. Narrated by Melissa Connell and Scott Rose. Copyright 2024 by Jewel Allen. Production copyright by Jewel Allen.